Hey everyone, tonight we'll delve into a name the Roman Senate tried to bury beneath gardens and laws, a goddess whose shadow drinks the night and speaks through the owl that haunts the Esquiline, and you've probably won. Want to believe what you are about to hear, because the undertakers once kept her grove like a ledger of the city's breath. Before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post a comment with location and local time, because somewhere an ancient bell tolls at the exact second this story opens its eyes again. Now close your eyes. Imagine the ancient mountains, and let's unravel this epic tale together. You stand by the Esquiline, where the wind along the old Agger tastes of lime and lamp smoke in the owl. Esquiline slices the night as if a blade were drawn along the rim of a funerary cup. Beneath the gardens of Mycenas, the earth remembers pits once called puticuli, where bodies were hastily buried outside the walls. And the soil kept the city's secrets with ruthless efficiency. Horace once wrote of bones bleaching on that slope before terraces and pleasure walks covered the graves. And though poetry gilded the hill, the ground never forgot. The owl cries again, closer, and a whisper at your shoulder asks whether you are brave enough to speak the forbidden name, said to have been erased from a tablet by order, of men who feared what memory can do. Imagine you are on the sacred mount of civic pride, where green lawns now climb above the old cemetery, and feel how the past presses against your chest like a stone set into the tongue of a corpse. To your left stands an invisible border outside the Servian wall. The dead could be tended. Inside, order demanded purity, yet the wind does not honor lines scratched into maps of triumph. Somewhere nearby, undertakers once took their instructions in a grove dedicated to Libitina, a place where the logistics of farewell were administered with a stern grace that felt like ritual and contract at the same time. The whisper returns. Say her name, it insists, or the night will speak it for you. A mainstream truth pins the scene to the earth. Rome had a goddess linked to funerals, Libitina, remembered not only by pious murmurs, but by the very institutions of the city. Death trade the designators and libitinary, whose appointments, fees, and ledgers made mourning legible. In some ages, the grove of Libitina was a workplace as much as a holy precinct where a death could be registered. Like a debt in a procession could be scheduled between a magistrate's decree and a widow's trembling hand. Suetonius even preserves a terrifying arithmetic from Nero's reign. In a single autumn, 30,000 deaths entered the accounts of Libitina, turning sorrow into numbers that still echo like sandals on stone. If accounting can sanctify loss, it can also domesticate dread, and that is why rumor insists the true goddess required a darker tax than bronze. But listen, because another truth, older and feathered, brushes your ear as soft as down and as sharp as a talon. The strix, Rome's vampire bird, belongs to this night. It is a word that sounds like a scrape in the throat, a wing beating the syllable into the mouth of a sleeper who cannot move. A creature that drains warmth and leaves a chill that does not lift until the second rooster scry, scribed in whispers and in learned invective. The strix bends its head unnaturally and peels hunger from the darkness, becoming an emblem of all the ancient mysteries that wake when the city's lamps burn low. The owl you hear is only a mask, they say. What sits in the cypress might be a law-proof appetite that no Senate decree can prosecute. Here is the bizarre detail that catches in your mind and refuses to let go, as if snagged on a thorn. Some claim the goddess behind the funerals wears an owl, as patients, and once kept a votive box lined with feathers from birds that only fly in dreams. Others mutter that in places where the Libitina law set prices for beers and pallbearers, a second, quieter tariff was paid in red thread knotted around the wrist. The color chosen to satisfy eyes that prefer shadows to coin. A lead tablet might be folded around a name and pricked with a talon mark, then sunk into a clay jarn, as a curse of malice, but as a contract of passage, a way to keep the deities from arguing over a single life. A goddess of funerals does not need altars of gold, if every parting breath is already a hymn in her key. You walk forward, and the gardens above the dead ripple in the night breeze, the same grounds where Mycenas landscaped a new Rome upon the old, burying the stench beneath perfumed paths and making culture bloom over what city labor once discarded. Some scholars argue haltingly against the simple story that a single patron redeveloped a pauper's cemetery. But even their caution admits a transformation took place, a deliberate smoothing of civic memory where rough places had been. This is how empires handle ghosts. with engineering, with poetry, and with a calendar of festivals that make dread appear manageable under stars that never sleep. And yet the owl's cry does not fade, because birds do not read decrees, and deities do not answer to marble. At the edge of the slope you listen to the faint blade clang of a distant watchman, to a cartwheel complaining as it moves under a late load, and to that soft breath behind your ear that is not yours. Rome knew 1,000 forms of boundary, wall, and right. Tax and title land for every wall the city raised, a story grew wings to fly over it and roost where law could not reach. In the hush between sounds, a second stranger silence opens. The kind sailors hear at Ostia, when the tide holds its tongue, and they remember to touch the amulet hidden under their tunic. The owl calls again, measuring you as you measure the night. Imagine for a moment a council fire of deities, where Greek mythology lends its oldest griefs to Roman order, and names switch masks like actors stepping from one tragedy to another under a shared moon. Heroes never walk alone in stories like this. They are escorted by rumors and guided by birds, and sometimes the bravest act is not a sword stroke, but the quiet of a name spoken into a place that would prefer silence. A city of laws grows from fear into power, but it also grows from power into awe, and awe is the one coin no magistrate can counterfeit. If there is a vampire goddess in Rome, she does not leave punctures on the skin so much as she leaves an emptiness in the air where speech refuses to go. The night presses closer, and the grove weather of memory or of map feels near enough to touch, as if the next breath will taste of myrrh, of damp bark, and of ash carefully swept into an urn at dawn. You recall that the undertakers once kept their accounts in a sacred precinct, and that each entry quieted a household's panic with the assurance that the city still knew their dead by name. This is the part of the story that is as tender as it is frightening. Even the most frightening deities keep a kind of order. An order, however stern, can be a strange kindness. But what order do the owls keep when the last lamplight gutters out and the ledger closes for the night? Here at the brink of the Esquiline, the wind asks again whether you will speak the suppressed name, and whether the Senate truly ever erased anything more than ink, and whether erasure can survive a city that dreams out loud. The owl waits poised on a cypress branch above what used to be pits and is now a promenade. And the sound the branch makes is like a hinge turning toward an unopened door. If you say the name, will the grove accept it? And if you refuse, will the silence claim the right to speak in your place? But the question that remained was this. What would happen if a night bird that drinks warmth leans close enough to hear the true name echoed back from your own mouth? You follow a blue thread of funeral smoke toward the Esquiline where the grove called. Lucas Libitina once stood like a ledger bound in bark, and every breath from the pyres tastes faintly of bronze, as coins click like teeth in the dark. The undertakers' Libitinary once kept offices here beneath the cypress shade, registering deaths and hiring mourners, a bureaucracy of sorrow arranged under a goddess whose name became a byword for death itself. In the bustling calculus of Rome, a mainstream truth steadies the hand that holds your lamp. A coin was deposited at Libitina, sanctuary whenever a person died, a death tax remembered as old as Servius Tullius and as immediate as grief in a kitchen before dawn. The disagnators, funeral directors in dark attire, organized the procession with the precision of a military drill. Their instructions crisp as winter air, and their authority felt in the measured cadence of flutes, steps, and lamentations. Coins pass palm to palm like tiny moons, and then vanish into the grove's treasury, a ritualized payment that lets the city keep count. As if arithmetic could tether the unruly tide of sorrow that laps at every doorway. You watch a clerk's stylus bite wax as a name enters the register, and the noise is small but permanent, like a pin pressed through a moth S-wing to hold it on the tablet of the city's collective memory. When the plague rose under Nero, Suetonius says the accounts of Libitina received 30,000 entries in a single autumn, and the figure hangs in the air like ash that refuses to settle on the leaves. Some nights rumor insists the coin alone was not enough, that the true death tax preferred something warm and living. Though the law only counted metal, and the ledgers never learned to write the word for hunger. Imagine stepping through the arch of Gallienus at the old Porta Esquilina, hearing the undertakers. Bells ring to warn of ritual pollution, as red-clad corpse carriers move with their grim efficiency beyond the city's purer heart. The bell is a bizarre detail that lingers. Its chime is both caution and courtesy. a sonic veil for priests and passers-by, and the pitying scrape of its note threads through the alleyways like a dissolving prayer. Beyond the gate, the ground remembers the putically open pits where the poor and unclaimed once descended. A lattice of squared mouths cut into the earth and filled until the soil forgot how to breathe. Adolfo Lanciani counted their grid as if reading a dark city beneath the city, estimating pits 5 by 4 meters and 10 meters deep. Their walls lined with tufa, their contents an archive of mingled lives. You tilt the lamp and think of Horace writing about a potter's field beneath future gardens. And the line between poetry and archaeology blurs where bones and verses share a slope under the same exacting moon. Later, Maecenas poured terraces and culture over the stench, transforming topography and memory together. As if design were a bomb that could make the nose forget and the heart pretend it had always been beautiful here. Some scholars urge caution, reminding that the Esquiline story is layered and politic. Yet even caution concedes the Grove's reality in the undertakers' headquarters, where civic sorrow became an art of logistics. In the Grove, a panel of funeral directors once coordinated supply like quartermasters of passage, the monopoly set by leges, Libitinaria, ensuring that grief arrived in order and concluded in a timetable the living could manage. A footnote of the city's soul. The designator's black hat marks the role that touches sorrow without handling the corpse. Ritual segregation of touch, image, and responsibility that turns death into a choreographed civility.
Etruscan roots rustle under the Roman mask,
as some trace Libitina's name to older soil. And red Alpinu and the ghost of Venus Libitina. Love and funerals braided into one vine that flowers in shadow. Britannica still frames the sanctuary as a place where coin met registry. A sober reconciliation of spirituality and paperwork, proving that even in a city of heroes and deities, the living needed offices as much as oracles. Elsewhere, a scholar argues that Libitina might be more metonym than mistress, a liminal sign for the entire apparatus of death, reminding that ancient mysteries often hide in plain administrative sight. You catch another curious glint. The census of grief glides through shrines where other taxes once passed. And though the death coin is distinct from inheritance levies, Rome's genius was always to monetize the doorway between worlds. By the 9th day, the novendialis closes the public tier, and the family's rites mark a soft boundary where mourning ends and living must resume. While the libidinary withdraw like tidewater from a polished shore, in this grove the practical and the uncanny clasped hands bells and beers fees and flutes while the whisper of Greek mythology dissolves in the Latin leaves, and you sense that stories migrate the way owls do across borders that maps cannot hold. You think of Norse legends where Valkyries lift the fallen, and the comparison stings sweetly. There, the chooser of the slain. Here, the scheduler of the procession, two faces of one human need to guide endings with measured steps. A clerk sharpens a stylus and pauses, listening to a wing beat you also hear. And the ledgeress surface seems to ripple as if a feather traced the wax and left a signature no mortal hand could duplicate. What would you do if, while paying the coin that seals a name into the city's book, a draft like cold breath gathered behind the ear and suggested the real accounting happens after the bell stops ringing? You remember that heroes require roads and funerals alike, that deities tolerate contracts when it suits their appetite, and that ancient mysteries often announce themselves with small noises, the click of bronze, the hush after a chime. But the question that remained was whether the coins clicking like teeth in the grove are invitations for a different mouth in the cypress, a strix that awakens when arithmetic mistakes itself for absolution. You pause beneath the Esquiline cypress, and the owl's cry splits the air. Like cloth torn on a nail, a serration of sound that turns your breath shallow as you listen for the strix, the vampire bird. Rome pretended was only a tale told to drowse the city's fear. The leaves tremble with a draught colder than the evening, and it feels as if the night itself has leaned down, its inverted head gliding into your periphery with yellow eyes that do not blink so much as drink. A mainstream truth steadies the pulse in your throat. The strix enters the Roman record in learned voices, as well as alley whispers with authors, mapping it as a man-eating or infant-harassing nightbird whose hunger is as methodical as law, but answerable to none. Daniel Ogden's studies of strigoi and strigoi let you hear the old accusation that certain witches turned feathered by night swoop at windows and leave a waking household with a story too strange for the magistrate and too precise for disbelief. Imagine you are on the sacred mountain of civic pride, yet it is not. Greek mythology's powdered thunder you hear, but the smaller, crueler weather of wings sliding through branches where the undertakers once counted lives into the grove of Libitina. In your ear, a feather's scrape is almost a word, and the word almost a verdict. As if the ancient mysteries have stepped out of the commentary and are crossing the space between text and skin with unhurried certainty. You test the air. And the sound of the strix is not a hoot, but a knife drawn slowly along the rim of a funerary cup, producing a tone that lines your ribs like a second cage, precise and unmerciful. A bizarre detail insists on being noticed before courage arrives. The strix's head can seem to swivel farther than bone should allow, an elastic attention that marks prey not with rage but with a patient curiosity, older than temples. When the sleepless speak of sleep paralysis, they remember a weight on the chest and a breath that is not theirs. And Roman dread gave that sensation feathers and a beak, a way to explain why the body obeys fear more readily than reason at midnight. You think of how the law loves to categorize, and of how the strix never enters the courtroom, because this is a hunger that defies summons. A trespass the 12 tables cannot punish unless ink can bind wind. A sailor at Ostia swears the bird rides. Sprees like a thin blade of salt slipping through shutters that never quite meet, and he ties a charm of knotted thread and iron to his child's cradle, so that the night's appetite will snag and blunt. The Esquiline's necropolis rustles under your boots even now. It's puticularly remembered by scholars and stones alike, for here the city piled anonymous endings into orderly mouths of earth. And even such order breeds stories about what comes to feed unseen. You stand where Mycenaeus overlaid terraces like careful lids, but lids do not silence a heartbeat, and the grove's older rumor speaks of a deity who does not protest coin, but prefers warmth, who keeps accounts in breaths instead of numbers. Rome's deities are practical, and that practicality extends to dread, because fear that can be named is a tool, and fear that can be hired becomes a ritual. And the strix fits both roles when the city runs out of reasons to sleep. From Greek shores wafts the story of Lamia, a queen turned grief-struck devourer. Through the alleys of Rome, her echo alters its feathers. A foreign lament, learning Latin vowels and perching neatly on a local branch. This is how heroes and deities migrate without ships. How ancient mysteries pass from one mouth to another, until a bird becomes a woman becomes a warning that no one wishes to hear at the nursery door. The strigoi of distant Dacia hummed the same chord under a different sky, letters from cold frontiers telling of blue fires on graves and of the dead who test their chains when towns forget the rites that pin names back into the ground. Between these frontiers and this hill, fear standardizes itself the way legions do, wing beats marching in formation through memory, until a single sound in a cypress on the Esquiline can remind you of a river in Thrace and a shudder in Athens. What the writers teach and what the alleys insist are not contradictions, but translations. And the strix is the shared word for any night that will not stop asking for a portion more than dawn can afford to give. A lamp guttering beside you reveals a small offering, at the root a strip of red wool tied twice and a smear of oil, whose sheen refuses to decide if it is light or shadow, a humble hedge against whatever listens from the branch above. You remember that Libitina's precinct handled the burials and the billing sober? Necessary, dry as parchment. Yet some families preferred to appease the nightbird, as if the registry were only half the bargain and the other half was signed in hush. The mainstream fact is unmoving, even as nerves prickle. Roman sources truly speak of strigoi, witches or birds, beings of the dark that drink vitality, and that legacy remains. A chord you can hear if you hold still long enough under the trees. It explains why bells signaled pollution and why hands washed after touch. Because rituals keep behavior steady when explanations fail, and even a procedural city learns to bow its head when the intangible refuses to step aside. A quirky claim flits through the leaves and dips its beak in your doubt that the strix's feathers taste of iron, if caught on the tongue during an exorcistic chant, a way to prove the bird is real without ever letting anyone see it. Whether true or not, the thought salts your breath, and you swallow, as if swallowing a key for a door you promised never to open. A vow as fragile and binding as lentil chalk on a winter night. Think of Norse legends for a moment, of ravens whispering to a one-eyed god, and notice how differently knowledge moves here. Where a Roman nightbird teaches not the shape of battle, but the cadence of fear's accountancy, wears an epic stride toward gleaming gates, but you stand still in the dark and learn the heroism of listening. An art rarer than the sword, because it requires the hand to remain by the side when every bone demands movement. Greek mythology gives you a lexicon of metamorphoses of gods, wearing birds as easily as masks, and that tradition lends a frame to this Roman hunger without making it less. Roman less procedural, less intimately concerned with who pays and who is paid. A breath brushes your ear, and you know with an unteachable certainty that the strix's attention is a kind of contract. Not agreed to, but not breakable either. Drafted on the parchment of a night that counts time in heartbeats rather than hours. From below the hill, a faint clatter suggests a beer being tested for balance, and even that domestic noise seems like a reply, a reminder that the living respond to the unanswerable with wood joined properly and straps tightened twice. If fear has a psychology, it is the tidy mind of the city writing procedures where stories won't. Obey, and that is why the strix persists, because it is the whisper no rubric can dismiss without lying to the household it serves. Another owl calls from farther off, and the sound is not comfort but context, proving that the animal exists while doing nothing to explain the visitor whose gaze remains fixed on your ribs from the branch overhead. The necropolis under your feet seems to rise a thumb's breadth, not in motion but in implication, reminding that Rome's soil is a palimpsest of endings, that palimpsests are read best by those who risk tracing the erased lines. You decide to breathe in fours the way sailors do when a squall approaches, filling the lungs slowly and letting fear find a rhythm it cannot break without learning the tune. An old trick borrowed from men who cross long distances with little light. The city listens with you, its deities perched at the edges of their precincts, indifferent yet attentive, like judges who have heard every case and still allow a final sentence to be uttered without interruption. In that space, the strix becomes more than a bird and less than a god, a corridor where appetite transacts with ritual, where deities negotiate with households that refuse to be left without an answer at dawn. You do not move when a dark shape drops and rises again, testing not your flesh, but your steadiness, as if the night itself were assessing your worthiness to carry the next part of the story deeper into the grove. The bizarre detail returns at once. You imagine its eyes are not eyes, but polished seeds that sprout in darkness. And the sprouting is sight, and the sight is a hunger that blossoms when silence is watered by careful listening. In that image is the city's genius turned inside out, a garden of Mycenas inverted into a horticulture of dread. And even that thought pleases you, because anything that can be gardened might also be guided by a patient hand. But the question that remained was whether the law, as careful bells, and the undertaker, as precise ledgers, can keep a vampire bird from writing its own clauses onto your lungs when the next breath breaks the stillness. The leaves hush as if a judge has entered, and the cypress seems to lean closer, and you sense that the strix has left a sign on. The path ahead, a token that looks like a face with the eyes removed and the sockets polished smooth. The token on the path is a face without eyes, a votive mask with sockets polished like dewless wells, and the air around it tastes faintly of beeswax and old smoke, as if it has been carried through more than one funeral before coming to rest at your feet. When you lift it, the cypress shadow shifts, and something in the branch line above pauses with an attention. You feel rather than see a hush that suggests the mask is not an ornament, but an instrument meant to beg. A gaze from whatever lives in the dark. A mainstream truth steadies your thoughts. Romans' new masks intimately not only on the stage, but in the ancestral imagines wax portraits carried in. Funerals and displayed afterward in the atrium where memory learned to wear a face even after breath had left. Those imagines were sometimes worn by actors in processions, giving the illusion that heroes had returned to escort the newly dead. A sober magic where lineage stood up and walked behind the bier in a choreography of remembrance. The empty sockets you hold are not an imago's likeness, no features, no family, but a different grammar of face. Closer to the garden oscilla that hung between columns and trees, masks and discs that turned on strings to face whatever wind rose through the peristyle. Oscilla were not only decorations. Scholars have traced them in gardens and vines as alarm faces, swinging like quiet scarecrows. Their double-sided gazes meant to startle birds and perhaps to persuade the unseen to mind its distance. A bizarre detail presents itself with unnerving clarity, some oscilla and mask disc carvings favored. Dionysian theater visages. As if comedy and terror were a pair of eyelids, and now this eyeless face becomes the inverse. No lids, no pupils, only attention, without organ. You turn the mask in your hands, and the polished hollows suggest not blindness, but a readiness to receive eyes, a ritual socket into which sight might be borrowed and returned the way tools move between households that trust each other's craft. From Greek mythology, a whisper crosses the threshold. Lamia, queen undone by Hera's jealousy, was said in some tellings to remove her eyes, to take them out at home and set them back in, when moving through the world at night, a detail as intimate as it is monstrous. Theoi preserves the tradition's strange specificity, the removable eyes glinting like marbles in a lamplit jar, turning vision into a possession that can be laid aside when grief or rage grows heavy. Another retelling even describes her placing those eyes in a container by day, blind to daylight only to reclaim the gaze at night and go hunting through villages that tried to forget her name, a pattern as steady as the sea breath along Libya's coast. You kneel and the Esquiline's old breath rises dry from the soil, reminding that under these gardens the necropolis once spread like a chessboard of absence, pudically squared and deep, and anything hung in cypress would have had two audiences: birds of the air and deities of the below. The mask's emptiness becomes a suggestion. A priest might claim the goddess of this grove can pop out her eyes to see in every darkness at once, a power that feels less like spectacle and more like administration coverage, surveillance, a census of shadows. In Rome, where deities and offices often overlap, it is not absurd to imagine a goddess who manages vision like an undertaker, manages pallbearers, apportioning gaze where needed, withdrawing it where rites have already secured a threshold. You test the notion by holding the mask to your own face, and the emptiness cools your skin. The world becomes sound and texture. The owl's cloth tear cry, the grain of cypress bark, a thin line of myrrh from a forgotten unguent. While your mind supplies eyes you no longer possess, a mainstream fact keeps the trance from floating free. At funerals, the imagines of ancestors were set upon actors who resembled the dead, and the living wore the dead as faces, so that memory could cross the civic stage and sit in ivory chairs to witness itself. That theater of lineage becomes a compass here. If the living wore faces to escort the dead, perhaps the divine wears emptiness to escort vision. A reversal where sockets signify permission and eyes arrive on loan like a magistrate's lictors. You lower the mask and notice faint grooves where cords once threaded, the same kind of cuts that let oscilla spin in any stray breeze ready to meet the glance of sparrow or spirit. And suddenly the garden becomes a palace of turning faces. A priest in your memory, or is it the night speaking through? Memory or serves that the true goddess does not hoard sight. She allocates it, and in emergencies. She unseats her own gaze to see into coffins, catacombs, and courtyards at the same pulse. The bizarre detail completes the claim. Eyes popped free like pearls do not lose their hunger. They stare wherever placed, and if set within a votive mask, they multiply the direction of watching so that one pair becomes a dozen glances strung from cypress to column. You think of ancient mysteries that love to mix the domestic with the cosmic, a jar on a shelf containing a goddess's organ like a household tool, and suddenly the vast and the intimate clasp hands over a simple object that smells faintly of resin and cold bronze. Somewhere, a clerk's bell marks ritual pollution, and the oscillating ring feels like a counterweight to this eyeless calm, as if procedure were the city's way of ensuring that even deities who rearrange their faces do so on time and within earshot. Heroes in other tales swing swords at cyclopes and serpents, but here the heroism is steadier. To place an object back on its string to align the knot so the mask turns without snaring, to restore a guard posted not by soldiers but by attention itself. Norse legends drift briefly through your thoughts, one-eyed wisdom under a wind-stripped sky, and you understand how sacrifice and sight intertwine across cultures. How the cost of vision is paid either by a god at a well or by a goddess who learns to lend her gaze. This is not to flatten difference. Roman, in their choreography and contract, and what hangs in this grove must answer to the city's ledgers, even if it borrows a Greek queen's trick for unfastening the night. With the mask raised, the owl shifts again, and you imagine the strix testing you with a new metric, not fear, not flight, but your willingness to accept a gaze you did not grow, to become a hinge for sight that belongs to another will. You whisper a name you will not repeat, and the socket hollows feel briefly warm, as if some unseen iris rolled home, glanced once through you, and kept going to map the path from grove to catacomb, where frescoed owls stare beside laurel crowns. A mainstream note returns to ground the uncanny of the Esquiline necropolis, and the gardens of Mycenae remind that beauty and burial coexist. Hear that terraces rose over pits, and that citizens have always asked art to stand watch when law grows thin at the edges. You recall how Oscilla also pleased the eye in atriums and peristyles marble discs, worry lightly between columns with masks of Dionysus, and wonder whether this eyeless face is a cousin designed for places where the wind must do more than decorate. The strix's presence remains a pressure rather than a shape, a contract still unsigned, and you suspect that if the goddess truly can reassign her eyes, the bird is only ever interested in whether the loan is repaid in attention or in warmth. A trick of psychology flickers pareidolia and reverse wear features vanish, and mind insists on a gaze. Proving how the brain prints eyes onto any mask, how the body cannot endure being. Unwatched, how even emptiness becomes a watcher under stress. If fear is a craftsman, it uses simple tools. A face without eyes, a legend of a queen who keeps her sight in a jar, a garden cord where wind tugs at marble, in a city that believes procedure can hold the night to terms. You tie the mask to a low branch, feeling the twine bite bark, and as it begins to turn, the owl calls once as if acknowledging a post reinstated, a sentinel restored a peace. Placed back on a board that spans house and tomb. Greek mythology has many horrors, but few as intimate as Lamia's removable vision, and when that intimacy crosses into Rome, it becomes procedural. It's a resource to be assigned, withdrawn, and noted in the margins of a ledger that never closes. You step back, and the mask faces you without eyes, and you understand that some deities prefer reflection to portrait, function to appearance, and that this is a goddess who chooses sockets over pupils, because a socket can hold any truth it needs to borrow. The owl quiets, and the garden's oscillations settle into a new periodicity you can feel in your bones. A metronome of watching and being watched that persuades the night to behave, if only for a handful of breaths. But the question that remained was whether those borrowed eyes, if they truly ride the air from mask to house to catacomb, ever return clean, or if every loan of vision carries back a stain of what it has seen and asks the lender to drink it. You step into an alley where the wind moves like a feathered malediction, and the rumor that withered women slip their skins to become strigi's brushes, the nape of the neck with a touch to knowing to be only air. The word rides the night as softly as dust strix striga. Strigus, and in that sibilance lives a quarrel between reason and the ancient mysteries that reason keeps reposting to later hours, as if dawn were an extension on a debt of fear. A mainstream truth steadies the mind. Ovid's calendar song preserves the nocturnal Lemuria rites when Romans rose at midnight, cast black beans behind them, and made a hand sign, thumb pressed within the fingers toward what walks and watches among the voiceless dead. He marks the hush when dogs and hedgerow birds fall silent, and in that deliberate silence the living address the deities with simple counters and measured words, because ritual, like a hero's shield, is designed for impact even when no enemy can be seen. Imagine you are on the sacred mountain of civic memory and hear Ovid's cadence as a slow drum for the procession of heroes and shades. A reminder that Greek mythology's eloquence and Roman order often share the same doorway at midnight. In that doorway strigi's perch where law cannot follow and learned voices admit their outline. Night birds or night women who drain warmth and strength, an appetite that the city can neither indict nor ignore without cracking some indispensable part of its own certainty. Daniel Ogden's pages whisper how the strix bleeds into the witch, the saga who swoops, the striga who sucks, and how accusations flutter to the oldest roofs in the city when a child wakes pale and a cradle amulet snaps its cord. You hear a cracked laugh from a shutter above, and the timbre belongs to no one in particular, which is exactly how these stories move, faceless, frictionless, yet weighted with the memory of a wing knock against a casement where the lamp forgot to burn. A bizarre detail flashes by like a moth in lamplight. Some swore the strix, his feathers were bitter as iron on the tongue, proof that the night had a mineral taste, and that a chant could catch metal from air with syllables alone. The alley bends toward the Esquiline's reclaimed ground and Priapus, a sold joke from Horace. A satire intrudes the garden guardian, who scatters witches with a rude noise, a comic miracle that implies the city still trusts laughter to bend the spine of dread. Under the joke lives a map because Horace places those rites near the gardens of Mycenas, on soil that had been cemetery, so the laughter comes with a knowing grimace, the kind that heroes sometimes wear when battle songs cover older groans. A mainstream fact anchors the grin. Roman authorities did sometimes push back at the shadow trade. Agrippa expelled magicians in 33 BCE, revealing a city that polices the boundary where deities are petitioned and nightmares are hired to do the same work under a darker name. If expulsion cleans the streets, it does not clear the air. The strix's reputation remains like smoke after incense, a manageable nuisance for noon, and a jurisprudential embarrassment for midnight, when the wind edits the statutes. You listen for sandals, and hear only the feather quiet of things that prefer. The past tense, a soft investment of attention that makes the skin remember what the brain declines to code, a human compromise older than temples, and as necessary as sleep. From Ovid's Lemuria, the hand sign returns to them under finger's end. You find your own hand mimicking the gesture not out of credulity but because procedure gives the body something to do while the mind negotiates with a silence that does not blink, the hush you feel. Greek mythology's afterglow, where metamorphosis makes even fear into a creature with a grammar, and the grammar here turns withered women into strigoi, the way a verb turns at the end of a line to balance what came before. Horace's Canidia glides back through the foliage like a cautious rumor. Her name, a knot in Augustus's tidy cloth, a witch who trespasses into Mycenas's new order and reminds the promenading few that old tunnels run under every new terrace. Another mainstream note presses the claim home. Horace paints Canidia. It writes with enough detail to make satire feel like documentation, grave dust, potion craft, nocturnal trespass, so that the reader's laughter arrives with the uneasy suspicion that the map under the joke is exact. You imagine the Libitinary listening from their grove, practical men of beers and fees, and wonder whether they ever bent to pick up a fallen feather before returning to the ledger, a tiny superstition in an office that preferred numbers to omens. From the frontier comes a colder draft, the word strigoi, walking in Dacian boots, another dialect for the same fret that shakes shutters when the moon thins and graves seem closer to the street than any honest plan of the city allows. The cross-drift of terms is not contamination, but chorus, a choir of warnings that harmonize at the threshold, where families keep watch through the small hours, and heroes do not cross the door because the bravest deed is sometimes simply staying awake. A quirky image tugs at your sleeve, a householder remembering. Ovid sets a dish of beans by the lintel and whispers the formula, then fastens a pin of iron to the cradle's strap, trusting that a small weight of earth's blood makes the air think twice. The ritual's elegance lies in its modesty, no thunder, no duel, just the living's insistence that the deities be greeted, and the unspeaking be acknowledged, a protocol of courtesy designed to leave neither world insulted by omission. You trace the alley back to the cypress, and feel the mask from earlier turning on its string a hinge for whatever gaze the goddess lends, and a thought arrives with the softness of a wingtip on water. Perhaps the strix appetite is only the shadow of a civic hunger for order that never sleeps. Order eats the raw edges of panic and prefers a procedural chew. And that is why Ovid's calm description becomes braver than a boast. He teaches a way to move in the dark without collapsing into it. A heroism of measured steps rather than clashing bronze. Norse legends flare for a heartbeat ravens at a one-eyed god. Shoulders and the alley momentarily feels like a mead hall, where information weighs more than spears, knowledge passing between birds and deity as cleanly as a blade passes between ring links. Back in Rome, the owl blinks and the strix does not, because the strix is not a species but a decision, a way the night chooses to be felt when stories and law refuse to shake hands. And that decision keeps returning to doorways and cots and ledgers. The mainstream core remains unchanged. Rome encoded nocturnal fear in rites like the Lemuria, in satires of witches, and in tidy expulsions that soothe the daylight conscience, leaving midnight to renegotiate the same treaty with a different pen. Priapus's comic blast lingers as the alley exhales, reminder that laughter is a ritual too. City's way of releasing pressure from a pipe that runs under temples and theaters alike, balancing the sacred with a wink no shrine can outlaw. Last quirky rumor skims the eaves. If a strix feather is sewn into a pillow, dreams arrive in reverse, beginning with farewell and ending with hello an inversion, as tidy as a legal clause turned on its head to test whether the meaning still holds. You steady the breath and let the alley lengthen a corridor of measured steps toward the grove that counts the living by naming the dead, and you realize that every Roman fear worthy of a rite is also a Roman habit worthy of rehearsal. Heroes lift shields elsewhere. Here the heroism is to keep the hands still, to keep the beans dry, to keep the formula unbroken, to keep the lamp trimmed until the city. As deities recognize the posture of due attention and decline to escalate, Greek mythology leans at the threshold with a resigned smile. Knowing that metamorphosis is not always spectacle, but sometimes the small shift when an old woman becomes a bird only in the mind that needs a beak to explain a bruise. The owl calls from the cypress, and the sound stitches the alley to the hill. I seem that you cannot see, but can feel when the air cools, when the mind slows, when the heart finds a workable speed for the long midnight. But the question that remained was whether Ovid's quiet hand sign and Bean's Horace's laughing god, and Agrippa's stern expulsions ever truly closed the case, or if every remedy simply trims the darkness enough for the strix. To read the house numbers more clearly, you imagine a queen from Libya whose lullabies curdle mid-breath, a woman named Lamia who once basked in Zeus's attention until Hera's jealousy tore the future out of her arms, and left a hunger that learned to speak through the dark like a second tongue. The owl's clothed her cry from earlier seems to answer this older story, because when grief cannot sleep, it becomes an appetite. And Rome's alleys know how Greek mythology seeps under doors, changes its shoes, and walks Roman streets as if it had always lived here. A mainstream truth steadies the pulse. In classical accounts, Lamia is a beautiful Libyan queen, loved by Zeus, then punished by Hera, who steals or kills her children and drives her to hunt others. Children, a transformation recorded not just in rumor but in written tradition. Theoi preserves a chilling refinement that Hera deprives Lamia of sleep. And Zeus, unable to undo the curse, grants her a terrible workaround: the ability to remove and reinsert her eyes, so rest can occur in darkness unpoliced by eyelids. Another telling maps the same horror with a domestic precision, saying Lamia keeps her eyes in a jar by day, blind as stone until nightfall. When vision is screwed back into the skull like lantern wicks raised for hunting under a thin moon. The image slides easily into this grove's logic. A deity's administrative mercy, an ability allocated rather than healed, and suddenly the mask you tied to the cypress earlier feels less symbolic and more like a station where borrowed sight checks in and out. You can almost hear the gentle clink of those eyes in their jar, a sound like 2 coins in Libitina's treasury. And the parallel tugs at thought the city counts deaths in bronze, while a goddess of grief counts hours in glassy orbs that never blink. From Wikipedia's compendium arrives an unnerving precision. Zeus also gifts Lamia a prophetic edge and shapeshifting, making her less monster than liminal tool, a mobile omen that moves through villages and through the footnotes of philosophy with the same troubling efficiency. Diodorus Siculus even rationalizes her into a queen whose drunken blindness let cruelty bloom, inspiring the folk tale of eyes set in a vessel. Proof that legends can be audits of behavior as much as they are maps to monsters. Imagine standing in this Roman night while a Libyan cave-birth queen and a Corinthian Lamia from Philostratus mingle in the ear. The latter admitting to fattening lovers for fresh blood, the former still calculating hours without sleep, and both adjusting to local law by ignoring it. The bizarre detail cannot help repeating itself, as if testing the hinge of belief. Removable eyes as a gift against insomnia. A workaround more frightening than the curse, because rest trimmed from sight means dawn greets a predator. With new clarity and no remorse, you listen, calm and methodical, and the psychology is plain enough to explain to anyone awake at this hour. Chronic sleep deprivation breeds hallucination and obsession, and the myth translates that into a mechanical fixed take. The eyes out so the mind can collapse without the body's permission. Greek mythology excels at metamorphosis, but this change feels bureaucratic, an accommodation drafted between deities, which is why it travels so well into Rome. a city that understands the power of procedure to hold a catastrophe at polite arm's length. Once migrated, Lamia's legend rubs shoulders with Rome's night fairs, the strix above the Esquiline, the strigoi and Ovid. Hinterlands, and the result is a composite presence that tastes of both sea salt and city dust, an ancient mystery naturalized without losing its accent. You think of heroes and how epic songs prefer clear foes, yet this enemy is a sorrow that learned logistics, an appetite that keeps schedules, and a goddess who manages vision the way undertakers manage pallbearers, annotating, recalling, recording, never quite done. A mainstream anchor remains visible even through the haze. Late sources equate Lamia with impusi, ascetic tresses who drain men. Philostratus's Apollonius exposes one such illusion at Corinth. It's collapsing her phantom house with a diagnosis sharper than any sword. The lesson suits the city of deities, and laws, some battles, require a voice that names. The spell, not a spear that tears its hand, the Lamia becomes a test of discernment for heroes who must learn when the feast is only painted. Mist, and the bride a well-fed mirage. The quirky artifact glints again, a cedar casket meant for cosmetics repurposed into a daybed for eyes, lined with wool that carries the scent of myrrh. Because even horrors keep their tools clean when the night schedule is demanding. A hush follows, and in it a practical question ticks like a water clock. If vision can be detached, can conscience? And if conscience can be detached? Is the hunt only grief's automation, a set of motions performed by a sorrow that no longer remembers why it began? You recall that earlier whispers say her name, or the night willened. Now names feel like locks and keys because Lamia expands by being spoken, compresses by being understood, and perhaps accepts barter when addressed with the precise etiquette Ovid taught for restless shades. Across the mind's Selene, Norse legends flicker a one-eyed god trading sight for wisdom at a well, and the resonance is quiet but real, a reminder that deities often buy knowledge with organs, and that heroes are measured by what they can endure missing. Back in these Roman streets, the lamplight trims shadows along doorways where Libitinary once walked, and the practical men of the grove would have known to avoid arguing with a sleepless queen. They would have offered procedure and let the mask do its turning. The mainstream core doesn't change with retelling. Here's jealous violence, Zeus's compensatory gift, the jar of eyes. The hunt that continues after rage cools into routine. All these live on the page as much as on the tongue. And that page invites modern simplifications that still serve at midnight. Hera made her sleepless. Zeus made her eyes removable, a neat pair of clauses that fit on a scrap of memory and slide neatly under a listener. Pillow without tearing the fabric of belief. As you breathe in the cypress resin, the owl quiets to a waiting posture, and the wind along the Esquiline feels like fingers gliding over a closed book, promising that when reopened the text will be the same, even if the reader has changed. What would you do if the borrowed eyes rolled toward a window where a child slept, and the jar rattled softly with decision? Would a prayer to a Roman goddess of funerals outweigh a Greek queen's insomnia? Or must heroes intervene where deities have negotiated a terrible compromise? The night holds the question without blinking, and the mask you hung earlier turns once, catching no light and all the same attention. As if the city itself understands that some ancient mysteries are only survivable by distributing the watch among many careful faces. But the question that remained was whether Hera's sleeplessness and Zeus's remedy created a creature or a function, and if a function, who in Rome benefits each time the eyes click back into place and the hunt resumes with the calm of an officer doing the next required task. You unroll a scorched tablet, the color of late figs, and read a line where two names blurred, Libitina and Venuso, that ash becomes a grammar of love and death, sharing one altar as if the city preferred its opposites to kneel together. The soot rises in a thin breath that smells of myrrh and cypress, and a marginal hand cramped and stubborn notes that anniversaries and gardens pull Venus into the Libertinian grove the way a tide draws two streams into one mouth that never tires of tasting. A mainstream truth steadies the pulse of the hand that turns the tablet. Libitina is the Roman goddess of funerals and burial, her name, a metonym for death, her precinct the grove on the Esquiline, where undertakers set their ledgers beside ritual, making sorrow legible and actionable. Another line in the ash insists on a linkage the city could not quite unknot for Venus. Libitina is attested in learned summaries and antiquarian echoes, an epithet that braids desires. patron with the keeper of farewells and a single unsettling title. Britannica cautions that some later writers mistook Libitina for Venus Libentia, garden goddess and patron of growing things. Yet, even the warning preserves the closeness of the names, a phonetic corridor where worshippers could drift from blossom to beer without changing streets. Daniele Miano's study of love, death, and funerals maps the debate with careful fingers, showing how Libitina's very name became a metonym, how groves and personnel anchored meaning, and how the association with Venus was early, persistent, and contested like a boundary stone everyone touches. A marginal gloss quotes Varro, who yokes libet and libido to Venus, Libitina, and Libitina alike. A language bridge that makes the city's etymology perform theology and turns a lexicon into a procession with flutes, beers, and roses. Another scholar's page, crisp and old, lists a temple of Venus in the Libertinian Grove, a note that feels like a bell tolling twice. For one service, as if the same precinct handled gardens by day and departures by dusk with equal professionalism. The bizarre detail on the tablet's edge is a stain that looks like crushed grape, and someone has written Finalia Rustica beside it. August 19, a date that in some tellings belongs to Venus, and in others dips its cup in Jupiter's weather, leaving the altar sticky with ambiguity. You listen to the air and hear market girls and matrons petition Venus for beauty and favor, their myrtle and mint folded in roses, while somewhere a clerk in the same city registers a death with a coin in Libitina's treasury, and the two sounds meet like distant oars on one river. A mainstream anchor steadies the scene. The grove of Libitina was truly tied to undertakers too, the Dacianeters, and their practical craft, and the Esquiline. Reputation for ill-omened air made the precinct geography part of the theology, a map the owl could memorize. Miano's argument bends back into the ash to suggest a metonymic goddess, a figure who may have been forged by antiquarians from a place name and then clothed in rites, which would explain why Venus stands so near, offering the city a familiar face to mask a more technical divinity. Yet Kagavazulov's thesis hums in counterpoint, proposing that love and death belong together as a primordial rhythm, that Venus Libitina is not a mistake, but an intuition, a human truth that gardens and graves share a soil that refuses to choose. The 1911 encyclopedist's voice, careful and dry, still places her sanctuary in a sacred grove. Perhaps on the Esquiline, where by ordinance the apparatus of burial stood ready, implying that even if names blur, the tools do not. You run a finger over the tablet's edge and feel the grit of letters baked half-legible, and the line that survives says the coin of the dead falls into Venus's keeping, as well as Libitina says, an administrative poetry that feels both efficient and unnerving. Imagine for a moment Greek mythology watching from the portico the laughter of Aphrodite, turning thoughtful as she observes a Roman cousin who attends gardens and graves alike. A goddess who understands that fertility and funerary order are two sides of one civic virtue. The owl you have followed since the Esquiline cries once, and the sound threads through the words like a suture reminding that ancient mysteries prefer boundaries where categories meet and tremble, where heroes hesitate before altars that refuse to specialize. A quirky mark in the margin draws the eye, a tiny laurel sketched next to a sprig of myrtle, and beneath them a note. Love crowns beginnings. Death crowns endings. Both require hands, a household theology succinct enough to fit under any lintel. You recall that some inscriptions use ab luco libitina to locate a life? In Miano's reading of such locatives unknots the place into a person, or a person into a place, so that the city's grammar becomes a ritual in which movement and meaning are married. Another mainstream line survives the scorch, when a plague swelled the registers. The grove's capacity was exceeded, and Livy names a time when even Libitina could not keep up. A grim arithmetic that makes the shared altar feel less metaphysical and more necessary. The tablet's last intact corner mentions gardens under Venus's tutelage, an aside that should soften the scene. And yet the juxtaposition tightens the chest, as if trellises and stretchers had been catalogued in the same hand with different inks. A practical imagination can see the precinct by daylight vines, benches, pale stone, and by night the same paths serving mourners, same breeze turning a hanging mask, the same goddess listening with two names to requests that rhyme in opposite directions. Norse legends cross the threshold briefly, a one-eyed god remembering that knowledge is paid for in pieces of self. And the crossing suggests that love and death too exact their portions, each a ledger in the same cosmic office. You taste ash and rose together on the tongue and understand why scribes disagreed in the margins, because if Venus Libitina is a confusion, it is a useful confusion, and if it is a truth that makes ceremonies blush and proceed anyway. What would you do if a family asked which altar to choose for a vow that binds a marriage against a winter of plague? Would the coin fall to love, to death, or to a goddess who signs both ledgers with the same steady hand? But the question that remained was whether the city invented Venus Libitina to keep its opposites supervised, or whether the goddess revealed herself in the scorch where names fuse, reminding that every offering made to beauty carries a receipt printable in ash. You walk with the disagnators as dawn keeps its distance, their staffs tapping a quiet metronome, while mourners hum a low chant. And every footfall seems to pass beneath the gazes of ancestral busts, as if the imagines had stepped off their shelves to supervise the living one last time. The air tastes of oil and laurel, and behind the procession, a clerk peels away toward the grove where a coin will clink into Libitina's registry. A sound too small for grief, yet exactly the size of bureaucracy, while a colder tithe than written slips under the ledger and into rumor. A mainstream truth steadies the scene like a hand beneath a bier. Roman funerary practice is choreography as much as consolation. With the pompa funebris winding from house to forum to tomb, led by professionals who translate sorrow into civic order, the designator named in sources as the choreographer of the march sets interval and sequence, placing trumpeters, pallbearers, and prefects where their voices will bite cleanly into the street's long corridor, so that lament and law keep time together. You pass beneath balconies where imagines once hung, and in elite houses those wax ancestor masks would join the procession on actors. Faces the dead, escorting the dead with a gaze that glows like beeswax over lamplight, turning memory into moving architecture. A second mainstream note sharpens the image. The imagines when paraded with full honors could culminate in a public eulogy, the line of masks, a resume of a family's heroes, each achievement a rung on a ladder that reaches from tomb to rostra and back. The bizarre detail is not theatrical, but logistical. An edile might assign a lictor to the designator granting the procession right of way and suspending business proof that even grief receives an escort in Rome, a city where deities and deadlines share hallways. Smart as stories and maternum relief, flashes in imagination. Its carved crowd stacked like a choir of stone, musicians swelling ahead of the bier, while clients and freedmen line the flank. The image is dusty yet noisy in the mind, a fossilized cadence resurrected by the eye. Behind the music clings the undertaker's smell of linen and resin, the liberatinary operating out of the grove that kept the register, where the coin falls into the temple's treasury and the death becomes, officially, a civic fact that can be counted without flinching. The Nova Roma reconstruction, careful if modern, reminds that Vespalones carry the bier, and that 4 or 8 shoulders take the weight while the designator calls turns. A craft of angles and breadth that prevents a stumble from becoming a catastrophe. You study the faces along the line and notice hired mourners with controlled tears, their voices trained to break at the same syllable, a professional grief that holds the family's private ache on a public plate so the city can taste and recognize it. Pollution clings to the margins of all this order, a ritual danger that demands washing, fire, and time, because death in Rome is a problem to be solved as much as a wound to be dressed, and solutions have schedules for a reason. Another mainstream anchor confirms the bureaucratic undertow. The Grove of Libitina maintained a death register, and in Nero's plague a single autumn saw 30,000 names inscribed, a number that makes the procession's neat cadence tremble without losing step. You imagine the coin itself dull-warmed from the clerk's palm dropping into the temple chest like a tiny planet captured by a larger orbit, and the thought comes uninvited that planets too are a kind of procession the eye mistakes for permanence. Along a colonnade, a boy carries an effigy, recalling Dio's tale of wax likenesses tended with peacock feather courtesy. The theater of lion in state reproduced on wheels so distance cannot exclude the poor from the privileged grammar of farewell. Ancestors at the gate join the march, and scholarship to charioting imagines to the tomb so the living walk flanked by their own future, a didactic corridor designed to make every step a lesson and every mask a pointed sentence. Britannica's spare voice murmurs that Libitina may once have been earthbound, a nature goddess braided into funerary work until the braid defined her, and your eye catches on garden trellises, where on other days Venus receives petitions that rhyme with mourning in ways no one admits aloud. The undertaker's manual hides an epigraphy and law, a monopoly and a contractor, fixed prices and fines, the Lucas's office as well as sacred precinct revealing how the city turned death into a service whose efficiency could be audited by magistrates and gods alike. A quirky moment interrupts the gravity, the prefecate pause between stanzas to wet their throats, and a trumpeter quietly tests a note that sounds like a bird nicking the sky with its beak, reminding that breath is both instrument and message until it isn't. At a corner, the designator raises two fingers and the line tightens to pass beneath arches where heroes. Busts stare from niches, a stone audience who once wore breathing faces in processions like this. And memory presses on the back of the neck with a firm, cool hand. The city's ethics appear in profile clients, present freedmen, present women, veiled men and ranks, because the Pompa Funebris is a mirror that shows Rome to itself and invites the deities to judge whether the reflection holds steady under the weight it carries. From the grove, the coin's echo arrives belatedly, and you remember that Servius Tullius is credited with establishing the death tax, a tradition so old it passes for gravity, the kind of rule that carries its own explanation in the way it never seems to end. Yano's cool hand annotates the margin within the mind Libitina as metonym love and death braided by language and precinct in the annotation feels like a light knuckle rap on the procession's door, asking whether anyone remembers why the road curves toward the Esquiline at all. The emitter Mealy refuses to fade. You see anew what the stone insists upon. The funeral is a spectacle because status needs an aftermage. The aftermage is a petition to memory written in bodies rather than ink. A second law text in your mental satchel whispers that even use of the forum may be suspended for a leading man. Its rites, underscoring how the Pampa can pause the city's pulse in exchange for permission to restart it, newly calibrated to absence. You pass a door where a small laurel wreath hangs low, and the gesture is both private and public. A household saying yes to the city's script while keeping one whisper for its own. The whisper that the designator cannot choreograph and the ledger cannot capture. The imagines, miles ahead yet somehow close, pivot in thought from wax to intention. And you understand that what heroes leave behind is not only biography but cadence, a way of organizing steps so the next to die can borrow posture and weather. Back at the grove, the libertinary post prices others must pay, a tariff of sorrow that offends and reassures in the same breath, because to price mourning is to admit it can be handled, and handling is what the living most urgently need. A final, quirky image catches at the mind's heel. The designator's staff is nicked from years of counting pavement seams. Each notch a day, the city learned again how to carry weight without breaking stride or spilling the music. Heroes in other epics fight hydras and wolves from Norse legends. But here the enemy is confusion, and the victory is alignment. A procession so clear, even the strix must keep to the edges, listening for a gap where appetite can speak. The chant modulates a measured descent toward the Esquiline's old breath, and you feel the strange calm of procedure working like a bridge that never boasts, yet holds a civic muscle that flexes silently. Under the skin of marble and law. The coin has fallen, the ledger has scratched, the music has leaned, and still a colder tithe turns under the page like an undertow or rumor that the night expects its own accounting payable and attentions the city cannot receipt. But the question that remained was whether the ancestors' masks and the designator, its perfect cadence, can truly keep the strix from slipping its bill between notes collecting interest on breaths as the procession passes the heroes who from their niches do not blink. You descend toward older soil where the language under Latin mutters through cracks, and a name like Alpinu rises with the cool of the earth, insistently whispering that Rome's funerary mask may cover an Etruscan face with older teeth. The cypress roots feel knuckled like inscriptions, and every knot underfoot hints at a script that traveled by tomb and mirror long before the undertakers. set up their registry in Libitina's grove above this breath of clay. A mainstream truth steadies the mind in this dim light. Etruscan funerary art shows a winged guide named Vanth, a benevolent psychopomp who appears beside the dying and the dead holding torch key, or scroll to light and unlock the next threshold. Her presence is not a metaphor in these chambers, but a repeated pattern, a figure on ash urns, and tomb walls sometimes rising. Out of the ground itself, as if the door were not a structure, but a gesture executed by a goddess with patient wings. You angle the lamp and picture her companion Charan, the underworld's hammer-bearer, whose grotesque features are apotropaic and whose tool is read as either a threat, a ward, or the very mallet that shuts the latches of death's door. Another source records how scholars debate Charon's exact role, some naming him a guide like the Greek ferryman, others granting him the right to strike or to protect, but all agreeing that the hammer is a sign that the passage requires more than a whisper to seal. In the flicker of flame you see a carved doorway between them, its stone dotted with triple bosses, the recurring icon of a portal that is more than masonry, locus medius where the living stand precisely at the hinge of what waits below. The bizarre detail catches your breath in Tarquinian reliefs and learned recounting twin. Sarun swing hammers near a noble's missing head, the menace posed and paused a frozen punctuation that says fate is not always gentle about concluding a sentence. You listen to the owl, hidden higher in the Rome dark, and feel how these older shapes lean forward. Not as rivals to the strix, but as precedents, a civilization that managed fear with guides and doormen rather than with bans and expulsions alone. Etruscan Pantheon notes keep pace with footsteps. Charon is never just the ferryman here, but a demon of death carrying a hammer. His presence less about boats than about enforcement at thresholds where words thin and choices narrow. Vanth, by contrast, is depicted almost kindly, a winged demoness whose torch makes navigation possible when tears blur the way. A difference of temperament that Etruscan funerary art preserves with a human precision Rome later admired and adapted. A mainstream anchor sets itself in the chamber as cool. Vanth and Charon appear in iconography from around the 4th century BCE onward. An artistic persistence that proves these figures were not ornamental, but structural to Greece's architecture. Their door often mirrors an earthly door, with those rows of bosses that tomb painters repeat. It's reminding you that the afterlife is imagined as a house the dead can enter with ceremony, and that ceremony needs officials who take their tools seriously. You kneel where the floor's dust turns to a faint paste under breath, and Alpanu's whisper slips nearer her name, glossed by antiquarians as a Lassa among the Etruscan attendants of fate and love, a figure who wears jewels, a loose cloak, and sometimes little else. Some lists equate her with willingness, a name aligned with willingly, implying that consent and offering form the grammar of her rites, which makes her proximity to underworld passages more intimate and more unsettling than anger alone could manage. A quirky note in an old compendium claims she appears on mirrors embracing other deities, coronet and earrings glinting. Beside a star at her head, a detail that turns a cosmetic object into a shrine that can be held in the hand and angled toward the soul. It is not hard to map that mirror to the eyeless mask that turned in the Esquiline breeze above, since both are reflective technologies. One for the face, one for the gaze, both inviting a goddess to step into a household object and hold watch without blinking. If Rome drew Libitina's precinct with contracts and fees, Etruria drew the same doorway with those winged attendants and that iron-sounding hammer, articulating a psychological truth in marble and pigment that any sleepless mourner can recognize. The owl moves softly along the rafters of your hearing, and the strix from earlier seems to wait for you to understand that a city inherits not only kings and laws, but also underworld professionals, whose job is to keep panic from drafting policy. A mainstream fact rounds the chamber like a second breath. Charon's grotesque appearance is commonly read as apotropaic, akin to Greek eyes on vessels and Gorgon, faces the ugliness turned into a shield to fend fear from the threshold it guards. Vanth's scroll, sometimes inscribed with her name, suggests fate recorded, a ledger of another order. And you recognize the resonance with Rome's Libertinian registrated ways of saying that endings are witnessed. Two filing systems for the same silence. Etruscan doors in paint and stone are never only architectural. They are verbs, actions of opening and closing dramatized as scenes in which demons behave like clerks with muscles and wings, and you find the image soothing in its practicality. The bizarre detail returns with a steadier heartbeat. Some scenes show Vanth emerging directly from the ground, a woman-shaped hinge agreeing with the body that the way out of grief is the same direction as the way in through, not around.
Alpanu's portfolio
Remains shadowy in texts, but the underworld association lingers her beauty and jewelry, suggesting that love and death share assistance, that a goddess of offering might stand politely to one side, as names pass from breath to stone. A traveler's note in a modern digest says Elpin, or Alpeno, is sometimes called a love deity of the underworld unclothed. Or in Loose Cloak and Sandals, a visual language that teaches that intimacy crosses thresholds more efficiently than force. You pause to test a word against your tongue willingness, and it fits here where contracts with the dead are signed by the living's steady posture, by the acceptance of torchlight, by the nod to a hammer. That means the door will shut behind without cruelty. Greek mythology enters politely, acknowledging that these are not its. Rhenia is not its ferryman, but neighbors who solve the same ancient mysteries with different tools, a family resemblance in the way all deities become administrators at the edge of speech. The psychology is simple enough to explain as the lamp gutters and steadies. When fear searches for a face, it can accept a guide with a key and a clerk with a hammer more easily than an unnamable dread that feeds because procedure is the lullaby of the wakeful. Above the earthline roams gardens of Mycenas, still breathe perfume over pits. But down here, the Etruscan habit of painting the precise moment of departure makes the passage feel supervised, a calm that rises not from denial, but from choreography. You can almost hear the quiet scrape of a nail across stone as a Charon leans his mallet on the ground rather than swinging it, the gesture a promise that the door will close when all names are ready, not a second before. A mainstream anchor hums in the bones of the corridor. Vanth and Chiron are paired off in attendants of death rather than judges. A duet that shows the Etruscan dead escorted rather than condemned, in ethics of guidance that leaves room for breath even in endings. The quirky artifact in your Paquita, flake of mirror glass found near the steps, glints once, and you imagine Alpanu's star behind her head, shining in miniature, a reminder that looking is itself a rite when aimed at thresholds with care. When you rise, the Esquiline wind returns to the lungs as if borrowed air had been held below and now repaid. And the owl's silence feels like respect, a winged witness who has followed you through cultures that agree more than they argue. You understand that Rome's Libitina might be read as a metonym, and that metonym may sit comfortably beside Etruscan habit, each favoring the same service with different uniforms, each declaring that the dead deserve escorts who keep tools polished and doors honest. Even the strix appears different in this light, less a trespasser than a stress test for the system. A way for the night to ask whether the living remember their passwords of beans, bells, torches, keys, and a mallet's quiet authority. The cypress groans softly like a beam in an old house, and the mask you hung earlier seems to turn bellow ground as well as above. Sockets accepting any gaze the goddess lends, ready to meet Vanth's, torch, or Charon's stare without flinching. Heroes elsewhere lift spears in Greek mythology, and wolves howl in Norse legends, but here the heroism is to descend. To read the door, to admit that older hands taught Rome how to hold the grief weight without splitting the wood of the bier. Back at the threshold, your lamp shows the triple bosses again, and the pattern looks like punctuation carved into masonry, a semicolon between lives rather than a perioding, dividing the living to finish the sentence aloud before stepping through. You ascend toward the Esquiline air, and the smell of laurel and resin returns, with the quiet rhythm of a city that remembers its predecessors, the way a child remembers an ancestor's hand on the shoulder, firm, warm, and unafraid of the dark. But the question that remained was whether Alpanu's willing gaze, Vanth's scroll and key, and Charon's hammer once stood invisibly behind Libitina's ledger, and if so, which face the night expects to see when the mask above the grove turns to meet its hunger. You unroll a strip of lead that crunches like thin ice and discover a lattice of letters cut by a trembling hand. A defixio that carries a lover's plea in cramped Greek and Latin. The words wrapped around a bird-scratched sigil that looks suspiciously like a talon dragged once, firmly across the metal. The tablet, folded and refolded, bears the classic technologies of hurt-pierce marks. Where a nail once fastened a desire to punishment voces magicae, that speak in a language meant for spirits and a layout that runs like booster feed, to confuse anything too human to qualify for listening. A mainstream truth steadies the lamp's shiver. Cursed tablets known as defixiones were spread across the Greco-Roman world from the 5th century BCE onward, typically inscribed on lead, then rolled, pierced, and deposited in graves, wells, and sanctuaries, to enlist underworld intermediaries against rivals in love, sport, or court. Scholars published them from wells outside the Athenian agora, where Roman-era deposits held tight. Rolls of lead whose invocations mingle Egyptian Seftifin with Roman gods. The syncretism proof that Greek mythology and local practice interleaved, where water and depth made place into a threshold. The Greek magical papyri echo the same grammar of compulsion voces. Mysticae, characters figurines, planted in liminal sites, revealing how ritualized speech and image ride the border between petition and command, an ethics of asking sharpened by symbols and narrowed by secrecy. You feel the old habit in the metal. Professionals prepared blank curse tablets in advance with spaces for names. A sinister stationery that let buyers insert enemies or lovers as easily as a clerk fills a line in a ledger binding bodies at the hinge points of voice and will. The bizarre detail glints along the crease. Someone pressed a feather into the lead as it set, leaving a quill vein. Fossilized in gray, and the mind unavoidably leaps to the owl, whose presence in Roman belief could be nailed to a door to avert the very harm its visit had portended. Pliny's world had rules for nightbirds. And though the naturalist doubted some omens, the city thought otherwise, so an owl at noon spelled disaster. And the ritual countermeasure gruesome and practical converted El Bird to a patrapan with a single iron stroke. Ancient writers and later digesters keep repeating the rumor that witches and sorcerers turn into owls to feed on infants, a strand of dread that matches the strix you heard on the Esquiline and effectively merges legal suspicion with the ancient mysteries of metamorphosis. Elsewhere, in a more fragmentary tradition, feathers and owl organs turn up in recipes for protective or pharmaceutic remedies. The heart to pry secrets, the ash of feet to counter snakebite. The bird's very anatomy turned into an index of human needs arrayed against midnight. In the tablet's letters, you read a petition that binds a heart and stops the tongue of the rival, and the line between healer, lover, and accuser blurs, since this is a city where heroes parade by day and clients hire underworld clerks by night in the same careful cadence. A second mainstream anchor sets the defixio within a map. Graves and wells were the preferred post offices for underworld. Mail the vertical drop, doing half the theology, and some tablets were sealed with nails or folded into lead coffins alongside figurines to guarantee the recipient's attention. One of the most unnerving continuities appears in the papyri. Characters, little star claws, and wedge signs that repeat across centuries, visual keys meant to unlock hearings. With deities who, like all administrators, prefer documents stamped with the right authentication. You cannot ignore the way this lead feels in the hand, heavier than its weight, as if the message insists on being carried by a hero. And in that thought lies the civic dimension. The living feel compelled to oversee even their own vengeances within a code that the dead can recognize. The owl scratch returns you to Rome, to the Senate's city of deities and laws, where language hardens into procedure and procedure. Borrows symbols as needed, so that a feather pressed in lead becomes a receipt, a proof of service for a nightbird's notice. Language. Log recently describes new finds in Gaulish and Latin curse tablets, dropped into graves and pierced with nails, reminding that even at Empire fringes the same postal logic applied. Nail roll consign, as if iron and depth taught gods to listen more closely. Another report describes a Roman-era cemetery in France where multiple tablets invoked Mars by a local epithet, a provincial accent on an imperial practice, proving that compulsion travels with armies and settles wherever grief or grievance goes to ground. The Greek magical papyri helped decode why so many tablets look alike, the same stock phrases, the same coils of voces, because formulae were technologies, and coherence in the theater of petition functioned the way a rank does in a cohort: visible, comprehensible, and enforceable. A quirky practice peeks from the margin. Some tablets use palindromes or retrograde scripts, so the text looks like a trap that has already sprung a visual of inevitability, that no rival luck can parse forward without cutting a finger on the alphabet. You glance at the bird scratch again and sense how easily fear becomes architecture. One line of talon makes a corridor for dread to walk, and the tablet's miniature stage aligns with larger sets above. Groves masks, ledgers, and doors that shut with quiet, practiced finality. Another mainstream fact settles like silt. Figurines accompanied many curses matched to the spell's type and planted in grave springs and wells to stress the liminal because. Greek mythology taught that thresholds have keepers, and those keepers serve most attentively at borders. In a corner of the lead, you find Boustrophedon texts the plow line turn, making the reading snake like a field, and the metaphor feels apt, since the tablet tills a future in which the rival's steps falter, the lover's tongue softens, and the petitioner breathes easier by dawn. The owl traditions stubbornly overlap this plot. To hear a hoot was to anticipate loss, to dream of an owl was to fear robbery or shipwreck, and the Roman army's lore even blamed an owl omen before disaster at Carrhae, so that one bird becomes a chorus of constraints. A bizarre detail to file with the others, some believed a dead owl, nailed above a lintel, could cancel harm, a policy of reversal that suits a city enamored of legal fictions. What visits to wound can be coerced to guard if placed exactly where entry is negotiated. The Greek magical papyri speak of assuming a deity's persona during invocation, an audacity that pairs neatly with cursed tablet confidence, since to bind is also to speak as one entitled to bind. The ritual voice steps into a god mask the way actors stepped into imagines. Practitioners drew hieroglyph-like signs in later Greek magical texts, folding image into incantation, until the tablet reads like a star map for deities, with coordinates labeled in vowels stretched and doubled until sound itself becomes the courier. You hold the lead above the lamplight and trace the feather print, then the puncture, then the names, and every mark rhymes with the city's larger sheet of law, a palimpsest where underworld and forum annotate each other without asking permission. The mental picture widens to include Norse legends, if only for contrast. There are rune-stave burns on a spear shaft, here are nail-pins, a plea in a grave to technologies of speech through matter that tell heroes their voices must sometimes be hammered to be heard. Someone has added a tiny drawing characters nested like clouds beside the rival's name, and you realize that the tablet is also theater, a miniature stage where an unseen audience of deities watches to decide whether this performance merits intervention. The wind rifles the cypress and scatters a few downed feathers from some ordinary bird into the lamplight, and they adhere to your breath, as if to underline the section S thesis that air is the medium of binding, and that the strix prefers its contracts to ride the lungs. Another mainstream line closes the circle. Many tablets were pierced and then entrusted to water a well or spring, because the path downward is also the path backward to ancestors and arbiters, who can adjust the living's quarrels using levers mortals cannot touch. You imagine the Libitinary counting such finds without recording them. Practical men who would sweep a grave and leave a folded lead letter where it lay on the grounds that the dead-like deities have their own paperwork and their own deadlines. Greek mythology looms above with its metamorphic logic, teaching that a bird can be a woman and a word can be a thing, while Rome contributes the binding nail and the ledger, and between them the ancient mysteries achieve a bureaucratic poise that is unexpectedly soothing. The quirky aftertaste comes from a single palindrome blananabla. Along a fold not so much readable as wearable, like a charm that keeps turning back upon itself until it becomes a ring on the finger of a request that refuses to wander. You roll the tablet shut, slide the nail through its seam, and understand why so many were found intact. The message was meant to be silent, heavy, and bound until a deity. As clerk unrolled it in a place where the only sound is water gathering courage to fall, what would you do if the feather pressed into lead belonged not to a mundane owl, but to the strix? This larger rumor and the curse invited the knight to bind what the city could not. Would that subtraction from a rival breath count as justice, or merely arithmetic performed in shadow? The owl's far-off cry returns like a clerk's received, and the coincidence of sound and ritual makes the back of the neck cool, as if an office has logged this petition and filed it with other pleas that rustle faintly whenever the wind brushes the shelves. A last mainstream orientation. Nearly 1,500 defictions have been catalogued across the empire, a sediment of private urgencies that maps where the living felt least heard and most tempted to hire the underworld to adjudicate one nail at a time. You tuck the tablet into a pouch and feel its gravity as a tiny planet again. Then glance toward the grove's registry, and the strange symmetry forms ledgers above, letters below to counting houses that never meet and yet balance the city's breath. But the question that remained was whether tomorrow's tally in Libitina's records will include the quiet outcome of this feathered plea. And if the ink that looks wet in plague years is just another kind of binding spell the city writes upon itself when the numbers begin to feed. You study the line where the ledger turns carnivore, the autumn when a clerk writes a number that heats the wax and makes the stylus. Jump 30,000 dead entered in the accounts of Libitina, a plague tally that does not stop breathing when the page turns. The words are Suetonius's plain as iron. In a single autumn, 30,000 deaths are registered. At the shrine, and the sentence feels like a door slamming in a corridor as the city counts itself thinner by the scratch of a pen. A mainstream truth steadies the hand that holds this passage open. The Undertaker's Grove kept a death register. And in Nero's time, the ledger recorded an autumn so heavy that the coin clink in Libitina's chest must have sounded like hail on a mortuary roof. Britannica's sober line agrees that deaths were registered there for statistical purposes, institutionalizing mourning with numbers, converting grief into a civic measure that can be compared across seasons the way armies count shields after battle. You read the figure again, and imagine the clerk's lamp guttering, as the lists lengthen the census of loss, turning days into a procession of names that will not fit on one tablet, while the owl above the grove measures each entry with a motionless gaze. Another copy of Suetonius confirms the clause 30,000 in a single autumn, as if the city itself had exhaled and forgotten to inhale the breath stolen by a pestilence that knows both side streets and marble forums without needing map or permit. The ink looks wet on the mental page not because of metaphor, but because the mind refuses to let it dry. The number keeps reflecting lamplight like a puddle that appears shallow until a foot drops and discovers it is a well. You think of the puticuli, those squared mouths in the Esquiline earth, how even with Mycenae's terraces above, the old pits remember the weight of plague years, their geometry a mute readiness for any season when the city's arithmetic turns carnivorous again. Platner and Ashby's note on puticuli calls the name contemptuous, and the used promiscuous bodies of paupers and slaves thrown where they putrefy a pragmatic obscenity that empires tolerate when the calendar corners them with too many endings at once. The ledger's 30,000 becomes a drumbeat no procession can outpace. You're not yet the disagnators still tap their staffs, the libitories still file prices, and the city still insists on ceremony even when ceremony is outnumbered, because procedure is how Rome keeps its jaw from shaking. A mainstream anchor offers context from another century of devastation. The Antonine Plague will one day kill by the thousands daily in the city, and later writers will give the empire's grief new numbers and new names, but the habit of tallying remains the same grim genius. This calm is not cold. It is the heroism of counting when the urge is to run. The same composure Greek mythology admires when heroes face winds and monsters. Except here the monster is a sum that will not stay in the mouth without biting. The bizarre detail surfaces from rumor in the grove. A priest keeps a scale beside the registry and weighs each stylus after the day. Entries, believing the iron grows heavier with every name, as if the goddess exacts mass from memory to balance her accounts. Another caretaker whispers that the ink pot is lidded with a tiny bronze owl, and no one lifts the lid without tapping it thrice. A quiet superstition that makes the numbers arrive in an even cadence, as if the night accepts only measured knocks. Suetonius tucks the plague among other disasters, Britain's towns sacked, Syria nearly lost as if to remind that calamities hold hands, but the plague alone relaxes the emperor's temper, because lampoons, unlike fevers, can be endured without shrouds. You reimagine the scene in the registry: 3 clerks, 2 lamps, 1 bell for ritual pollution, and a pile of coins that looks like a small army of suns gone dark, waiting to be carried from the table to the chest, with the care of infants being moved to shade. From the puticuli's shadow rises the practical question of capacity. How many biers, how many shrouds, how many mourners can the city hire in one weekend? The answer is always more than yesterday, fewer than tomorrow, until the epidemic breaks or the ink runs out. A second text of Suetonius whispers the same Latin into the Arunico autumn noand, The repetition works like a hammer tapping a door frame to hear if it rings solid, and the wood rings hollow because the door is already open to what entered. Imagine standing in that room as the 30,000th name scratches home, and the clerk, numb with accuracy, straightens his back by looking at the mask you left in the cypress, a borrowed emptiness that still somehow widens the room's ability to endure looking. Britannica's matter-of-fact voice returns, Libitina as funerary goddess. Offices in her precinct, and in the calm wording lies a truth that almost heals. Institutions can be mercies when terror is ambient, and tallying, however raw, is a way to find a rhythm that does not collapse. Yet panic always prowls the edges of a ledger. A street hears an owl at noon and shudders. Mid-market, a rumor says boiling vinegar on the hearth keeps the strix away from the fevered, and the city suddenly smells like pickled breath and ash. The old Esquiline pits turn in thought like gears, a machine for endings concealed under walks and gardens in Mycenas. Terraces cannot muffle the memory that Rome long ago decided to put ugliness in ordered squares so it could face it later with laurel. A quirky side note glimmers in a marginal scullion. One scribe claims the goddess herself tallies backwards at night, reading the day. Names from last to first so that the dead are not sent into the dark facing away from the living who loved them. Another claims the ledger is kept under Venus's occasional supervision. An echo of Venus Libitina, as if love insists on auditing death's arithmetic to ensure that numbers do not erase the tender nouns that cling to them. Suetonius puts the plague among accidents of fortune, not crimes, a categorization that changes nothing about the weight of 30,000, but it reminds that some enemies do not take bribes or fear lictors. They simply walk through walls and lie down in beds uninvited. Consider Norse legends for breath, where ravens name the fallen to a one-eyed god, and see that naming and counting are kin to styles of respect that keep panic from growing teeth too quickly in the dark. Back at the Grove, the libertinary close their shutters with hands that smell of myrrh and coin, and the latched wood sounds like a measured exhale after a day of inhales that brought only news of endings and patient increments of ink. The mainstream fact does not move no matter how gently it is handled. The register once entered 30,000 deaths in a single autumn, and the sentence sits in the mind like a stone that neither sinks nor floats, only states. A bizarre artifact returns the bronze owl inklet, and someone has carved on its underside a tiny palindrome, as if the tool itself prays to return to a day when the numbers read the same in both directions because there were so few to write. The psychology of dread is simple to explain and hard to cure. Counting calms until it overwhelms, and then it terrifies, and then the only balm left is to put the pen down and listen for a sound that confirms the world still has timbre, a cartwheel, a trumpet testing breath, a mourner finding pitch. Greek mythology comes back as escort, reminding that even gods faced plagues and learned to aim their gifts through thresholds carefully, and Rome, lover of thresholds, writes another line in the ledger and rubs a temple that has not ached since yesterday's tally. You lay a finger on the page's margin and promise the number nothing except attention. And attention is the one currency panic cannot counterfeit, because a gaze that does not blink is harder to move than any coin counted into any chest. But the question that remained was whether the ledger's wet-looking ink feeds on the eyes that read it. If so, whether the goddess of funerals prefers this subtle nourishment. No. To any richer sacrifice the city is willing to lay upon her altar when the next autumn comes. You feel it settle on the chest, the way an unseen judge sets down a seal weight. Without weight in, the owl call you have been hearing becomes a syllable that belongs to neither bird nor human, an address that does not need a mouth to be spoken. The lungs work, the eyes know they are open, but the limbs are embargoed by a law older than the city's laws, and by the time the mind composes the word strix, the body has already admitted that the night can pin a hero as easily as a parchment can be pinned by a nail. A mainstream truth steadies the mind against the airless pressure. Roman and later writers truly linked nocturnal attacks to strigi's nightbirds or nightwomen that drink warmth and leave a household with a story that the magistrate cannot file, yet no family can forget. Another fact from the civic calendar enters like a measured breath. Ovid's Lemuria gives a midnight protocol: black beans cast behind, hand sign made with the thumb tucked between the fingers. Copper clashed 9 times so that households have something to do when dread sits on the chest like a prudent enemy. Imagine lying in a Roman room where the lamp is low and the fresco owl seems to watch. and the weight that holds the ribs still persuades the ears that the call outside belongs to a voice inside, and a single vowel begins to feel like a talon curled around the tongue. The phenomenon is simple to say aloud and impossible to refuse in the moment. The body is awake, but cannot move, and the brain supplies an intruder to explain the compression, a visitor size to fit both fear and culture, a shape learned from stories and perfected by silence. Quieter scholars between their glass cases and field notes have observed that sleep paralysis invites exactly this kind of witness, a presence that chooses a local. Masked strix in Rome, old hag elsewhere, and speaks without breath, because the chest is busy paying its debt to a weight that is partly dream, partly doctrine. Even now, along the Italian spine of later centuries, a tradition of chest-sitting presences survives in dialect and data, with modern interviews reporting vivid hallucinations and a fear of death while awake. It bound proof that the night recycles its old contracts under new names and in new hands. You let the air come for counts in and for counts out, and find that the owl call outside and the voice inside begin to harmonize a duet the city has been singing. Since Wells swallowed defictions and Grove's log names, each tool away to keep terror from improvising too much. The quirky detail that twitches in the mind like a wing. Some households placed a small bit of iron at the bed. Headboard, not a sword, only a pin or nail, on the theory that what pins a curse in a tablet can pin a nightbird. Rumor too would making the visitor forget its own grammar. Ovid's beans return to hand as if pockets had anticipated this strangle of air, and the fingers make the FIG's sign without instruction from pride or doubt. Because ritual, like rowing, commands muscles before it persuades memory, and the chest learns to rise under orders it recognizes. The owl's reputation supplies the choreography for the fear. A hoot at the wrong hour is a bill presented to the household. Nail the omen to the lintel, some say, and it will guard the door it meant to mark. Fold a feather in to lead, others say, and the underworld will docket the case. Greek mythology floats at the window with the calm of an accustomed escort, reminding that metamorphosis is not confined to bodies but extends to breaths. The same air that carries hymns carries nightbirds and names, and the only reliable difference is the posture of the listener. A mainstream anchor steadies the pulse against the vision that climbs the ribs. Daniel Ogden catalogues the strix and strigoi not as a single rumor but as a family of accusations and anxieties, a dossier of night attacks literature kept open for centuries because the case keeps returning. Even the Greek magical papyri, for all their mercantile audacity, concede that voices move matter when certain names are worn, and this explains how an owl becomes a voice in a paralyzed room. The night puts on a credential the way an actor puts on an ancestor's wax face. You remember the mask hanging back in the cypress eye socket's patient, and imagine the goddess. As borrowed gaze rolling through this room to check the pressure at the sternum, to count it, to adjust it the way a clerk adjusts a column so that despair does not overflow the page. Beneath the weight, a corner of the mind remains methodical enough to notice that, when fear explains itself with a being, the being tends to fit the city.
Ow.
In Rome, it is organized and named related to a precinct, given a rite made countable even as it crushes. Elsewhere, the same weight collects different colors, and yet the Italian peninsula keeps a persistent habit of seeing personalities. It sit on chests at night, a continuity that argues not for credulity but for the human need to socialize. Dread into someone who can be addressed. A bizarre image flickers and steadies. In some dreams, a beak taps once on the ribs, like a quill on a desk, and the sensation is almost administrative. A reminder note left on the body's door about debts owed to thresholds not yet crossed. If this is a city of deities and ledgers, then dread is also an accountant. And the difference between panic and procedure is whether the numbers are whispered as a sentence or recited as a charm, which is why Ovid's ninefold formulas feel more like breathing exercises than magic. You test the syllable that wants to climb the throat and find it is not a cry, but a fragment of a name, and naming is dangerous because it can summon or bind. The city teaches both logics, the cursed tablet and the registry, and the chest decides which it is doing based on whether the next breath comes. The owl call outside slides through the fig leaves and becomes less knife and more metronome, and with that shift, the arms release their embargo. Not because a law has changed, but because the body has learned how to outweight a statute that only ever had jurisdiction over panic. Mainstream fact holds its line as the wrists flex back toward ownership. Ovid's Lemuria endures as a map of domestic defense at midnight. A way to greet what presses without giving it the honor of definition. A ritual suited to houses that prefer good accounts to good arguments. Another fact about the strix literary dossier hardens a thought into a floorboard: the nightbird. Appetite is less a creature than a behavior assigned to a sound, and the behavior is taught by stories that travel better than any regiment because stories require only ears and a pressure on the chest. Modern papers from the peninsula's middle hills confirm the old wisdom in new terms. Sleep paralysis is common. Hallucinations are frequent. And culture supplies the face that sits on the sternum, proving that ancient mysteries have simply updated their letterheads without retiring their staff. A quirky addendum drifts by like an ash mote in lamplight. Some insist copper works better than bronze in the night, not because of the metal's purity, but because the sound is brighter, and brightness breaks the agreement between silence and weight more quickly than a murmur can. Greek mythology lends dignity to this housekeeping. To do a small rite well is to hold the line the way heroes hold a pass. And to endure a minute of wait without surrendering the breath's rhythm is victory, even if no bard sings praises when the room releases its claim. You sit up and find the mask again, not in the cypress, but in the mind, its corner where it has kept vigil since the first section, and the sockets meet the air like cupped hands inviting sight too. Settle and remain useful rather than predatory. Outside, the owl cries once, and this time the sound announces itself as weather, not visitor, a shift as plain as a coin moving from palm to chest. From rumor to registry, from dread to data, all in the time it takes for shoulders to remember how to belong to the person they carry. But the question that remained was whether fear itself is the author of the strix. Writing a nocturne on the chest and then stepping back to admire the signature, or whether a goddess in the grove leans close to borrow the breath and return it, counted to the ledger that never quite sleeps. You follow the Tiber out to where it tastes of brine and moon, and the wind at Ostia carries the hiss of foam against the molestones, a sound like parchment smoothed by a careful hand that knows the value of a straight line on a restless page. The port that fed a million mouths in Rome still breathes under ruined arcades and salt-streaked mosaics, and the night smells of tarfish and crushed fennel from a tavern that has not served in centuries but refuses to stop exhaling its old appetite. A mainstream truth steadies the wave shine in the eyes. Ostia Antica was the great harbor of Rome at the Tiber. Mouth bustling in the imperial age with warehouses, baths, and guild halls, its decumanous spine along which the city's hunger ran with efficient feet. Another line of history curves like a breakwater around the image. When storms outgrew the river port Claudius, and then Trajan built the great artificial harbors at Portus, the hexagon still mirrored today as Trajan's lake, a memory pond where empire's logistics learned a calmer geometry. You walk along the dark toward Isala Sacra, the man-made island between Ostia and Portus, where the necropolis sleeps among brick tombs that remember. Shipwrights, water carriers, and merchants, the middle class of a harbor that once synchronized tides with ledgers. In one tomb's mosaic, a dove carries olive sprigs above a biclinium, where friends once reclined for funerary banquets, and even now the pattern looks like a map for breath. How to enter, how to be seated, how to rise when the sea permits, and the dead agree. The quirky detail is a niche where amphories stand like domesticated waves, their clay shoulders remembering the tug of ropes and the bite of salt, and a relief shows a water carrier as if to say, here's who we were, and here's why we needed the sea to be calm. Sailors murmur that the strix rides the sea breeze as easily as it rides the alley wind in Rome, a rumor that asks the question, no chart answers. Can an amulet anchor air when air belongs to a bird that treats breath as a coastline to raid at will? On wrists and necks flash protective charms, and a mainstream anchor identifies them by their blunt vocabulary. Fashionum winged phalli and fiston phallus pendants meant to deflect the evil eye with shock laughter and the brazen logic that life force frightens misfortune away. A tinabulum clinks on a tavern, lintel small bells and bronze virility whip by the E. Breeze because sound itself is a ward when port gossip says an owl landed on a yardarm at noon and the crew refuses to haul until the air has been rescolded into compliance. A guide points toward the hexagon inland and the black backs of warehouses along the canal, repeating that Trajan's basins were meant To tame the sea's moods, a feat of topography that felt like a pact with Neptune and a bet against every rumor that breath can be stolen at night. The moon argues with the river's mouth, laying a silver road from wave to tomb, and in that argument the ancient mysteries peak. Greek mythology drifting in on cargo cults and temple dedications to Neptune and Portunus, Roman order measuring. The swell and amphora count, rather than prophecy. Walk long enough, and the Isella sacratombs evoke another truth, as centuries turned. Cremation gave way to inhumation, the bodies laid with goods and painted myths. A quiet pivot that says the Sea of Rome's belief learned a new current without abandoning the shore. You remember the owl's cloth tear, cry on the Esquiline, and realize how differently it sounds here thinner. Salt chapped as if the strix must skim wave edges to reach a sleeper in a dockside room where nets dry, and a boy holds a bulla under his shirt for luck. The soldiers who shipped out wore phallic pendants to their apotropaic forms, sometimes clenched into the manos fica gesture. At the tip, an obscene fig that doubles the charm's defiance, a portable sneer at the evil eye, and any night bird that presses on a rib. A mainstream line fixes the geography of fear and comfort. Acella Sacra's necropolis flanks the ancient Via Severiana tombs, opening like shops toward the road, inscriptions invoking the deities. All mosaics mix doves, vines, and gods from Egypt and Rome in a cosmopolitan grammar of endings. One quirky sailor's tale says, "A fashion on a cord must always point outward facing danger like a prow. It loses its charge and invites the very gaze it hopes to turn." Experimental tinkerers have even noted pendants designed to swivel forward as the wearer moves. The wave-skewed glosses over amphora shards embedded in the path, and a gull's cry masquerades as something older for a heartbeat. But the practical mind remembers that this port lived on grain, wine, and oil, that heroes here were stevedores and shipwrights, and that deities accepted function as devotion. At Tomb 30, a paint ghost of Serapis once watched the biclinium, along with Zeus, Hera, Mars, and Venus, proof that even near the serf households. Braided gods without fretting over borders like ropes spliced from different strands to hold one hull steady against a swell. The Strix rumor does not mind syncretism either. It skates across tongues as smoothly as a skiff across lagoon water, changing only the consonants needed to borrow a breath, leaving the rest of the fear intact and portable, ready for any doorway where salt dries on the hinge. A mainstream note keeps the scene sober. Ostia's decline came with shifting channels silting and the rise of Portus. Abandonment and malaria thinned the streets until the port dream lay quiet, which is why the night here feels less crowded by watchers and more by weather. You pause at the theater ruins, hear a ghosted rehearsal of voices practicing lines about heroes and deities, and think of Greek mythology's fondness for seaborne beauty alongside shipwrecking furies, twin truths that sailors in every age must keep in separate pockets to stay steady. A charm seller's stall survives in imagination. Strings of little bronzes jangling. And the man assures that a pendant's power is strongest when it draws a laugh and a blush. Because shame interrupts the evil eye, and the eye is a straight road the Strix prefers unless the road is suddenly crooked. On a wall, someone long ago scratched a fish and an anchor, and the anchor glares like an argument against a windborne thief, a promise that metal will hold even when air refuses to obey, a sentence as soothing as the grip on a rope that is never once broken in hand. A quirky superstition from the docks claims that if a hoot rides the gust during loading, the overseer must reverse one amphora, and every 10th stack mouth downward instead of up so that the night, his appetite finds only silence when it comes to drink. A sola sacra neat rows of tombs anchor the thought that the living here treated death like weather to be forecast and braced for. With porticos, reliefs of trades, and benches for later visits, a civic tenderness suited to a community that understood tides. Norse legends flicker briefly storm gods, and sea serpents, and the comparison clarifies. Roman temperament. Here the sea is engineered, persuaded into harbors and hexagons, while fear too is engineered into pendants and bells, a style of heroism that replaces clashing bronze with clever hinges. The moon lemons, the foam, and the breeze quickens. Hoot crosses the water like a blade, and instinct checks the pendants, checks the door peg, checks the bulla at the child's chest, because rituals that once worked in alleys should work by the sea, provided the wind does not learn a new grammar. A mainstream anchor closes the circle. Ostia Antica remains a well-preserved city of streets, baths, and guild mosaics. Its port story legible enough that even after centuries of salt and sun, a walker can find the same mix of commerce, cult, and caution that made the night's rumors bearable. The strix, if it rides the breeze, will find a field of small bronze arguments waiting fally bells. Fascinate, a community that accepts that ancient mysteries travel, but also that sailors carry their own weather, made of oath rope, and the predictive hum of a well-tuned hull. What would you do if an owl settled on the yardarm at noon, and the crew? Hexagon Harbor was built precisely to turn rumor into mere wind. But the question that remained was whether even Trajan's harbor and 100 charms can tether a nightbird that treats breath like coastline. Or if the only workable anchor is the old habit of aligning steps, stacking amphory with care and trusting that the sea respects a city that refuses to blink. You lift the lid of a small wooden pyxis, and the air that rises is sweet with resin and old perfume, a cedar-tinged breath that is weighted beneath. Fitted lid as neatly as a secret waits behind closed lips in a crowded atrium. The vessel is modest cylindrical lidded, meant for trinkets and ointments, but the weight in the palm suggests a life. Larger than cosmetics, the kind of intimate container that traveled from dressing table to shrine, while remembering each hand that trusted it. A mainstream truth steadies the pulse as sight adjusts to lamplight in the classical world pixsides. Held jewelry, perfume, incense, and medicines, a practical elegance that made them as common in daily love as in the quiet preparations for funerary rites. Within a pair of glassy orbs gleam like duelist stars cupped by shadow, their sheen closer to sculpture than anatomy. As if a statue blinked once and decided to leave its gaze inside a box shaped for human fingers. Greek mythology has long trained the eye to expect metamorphosis, but this feels procedural rather than miraculous. Inlaid eyes and glass pastes were standard technologies of seeing in bronze and marble meant to reflect light so a deity or hero could look in public dignity. The orb's echo-known practice, the Meru head of Augustus, still stares with inlaid glass pupils and calcite irises. And the effect is not suggestion, but presence, the kind of watch that warms a room without raising a hand. You tilt the pixies, and the orbs roll to meet one another with a soft click, each showing a faint banding within like a frozen ripple of molten glass, the kind that once made a statue's gaze catch lamplight and return it as a controlled civic attention. A narrow paper slips free, with them fibers shiny where oil found a home, and on it a sentence in a compact hand says, "I traded sleep for sight, and now the night borrows what I remove." A line that carries the chill of an ancient mystery repackaged for domestic use. The meaning lights at once on the remembered tale, Lamia's removable eyes, the Greek queen, Hera made sleepless, and Zeus pitied with a terrible gift, so day could be blind and night could hunt with inserted sight like wicks turned up for inevitable work. A mainstream anchor makes the image sturdier than rumor. Sources preserve the tradition of eyes kept apart by day and replaced for nocturnal vigilance. A myth whose practical tone suits a city that respects allocation as much as inspiration. The pixies smells faintly of perfume because that is what pixsides and their cousins. The unguentaria were born to carry oils, resins, and ointments blown into slim bottles, their glass necks remembering the pulse of the breath that shaped them. You imagine the orbs nestled beside a glass unguentarium, once filled with myrrh or cedar oil, the two tools of looking, and scent aligned in a kit too intimate to display and too necessary to discard. A household's quiet handshake with breath and gaze. The bizarre detail will not be denied by the nerves in the fingers. The glass feels faintly warm, though the room is cool, the temperature of something that has been under eyelids until recently, as if the goddess placed them here at dusk and stepped out to supervise distance. On the inside of the lid, a shallow ring indent suggests the orbs were meant to nest without rattling a craftsman's. It's courtesy that implies frequent use, the kind of repetition that turns a miracle into a routine and routine into a civic duty. Greek sculpture teaches the face to suppose life where light returns. Glass agate and paste were inlaid so a statue's eyes would answer glances in those same materials. Here, untethered feel less like trophies than like tools awaiting assignment from a deity who thinks in schedules. You recall the eyeless mask gently turning in the cypress its sockets, an invitation rather than an absence, and the thought arrives with clinical clarity. Sockets or administrative eyes are detachable resources, and a goddess who lends sight must also keep a ledger of where it goes. A mainstream fact snaps the reverie into context. Small lidded boxes of ivory and wood were common Roman possessions. Cosmetics. Jewelry. Keepsakes, precisely the sort of container that could be repurposed to hold something both fragile and indispensable. The note's handwriting has the economy of someone who writes often at night, and the lamp reveals a greased dark corner where a thumb must have pressed countless times the thumbprint of a habit that treats omnivision like an errand to be run before dawn. You hold one orb to the flame and see the faintest cloud within, a wisp-like breath on a winter morning trapped in glass. And remember that Roman artisans blew bottles for unguents by lung and pipe, making sight and scent siblings in the craft that summoned them into form. The owl outside softens its clothed call to something more patient, and the second-person weight of the city's gaze returns. This is Rome, where heroes are as likely to carry ledgers as swords and deities, except that a well-kept box can be a sanctuary when iron and marble have gone to bed. A quirky thought nudges the edge of belief. If statue eyes were made to look, what happens when those eyes are placed in a pyxis beside perfume? Do they begin to smell as well, learning rooms by the oils breathing around them until omnivision becomes omniscience by degrees? The mainstream counterpoint holds. Pyxides were ordinary, and the inlaid gaze was ordinary too, in the way that only ancient precision can make the extraordinary courteous, and courtesy is exactly what the night demands when entering rooms where the living have left their pulses on tables. A sliver of vellum beneath the note shows a curling series of characters, the Greek magical papyri's alphabet of compulsion, as if the eye's borrower signed them out under the same protocols that govern lead tablets, voice keys, and sealed wells. To explain this cleanly to any listener is easy. Jars and boxes keep what must be kept. Glass and ivory serve gods and mortals. Greek mythology lends motives. Roman craft lends hinges end. Suddenly omnivision sounds less like hubris and more like a workload carefully partitioned. You test the orbs back into the pixies, and the lid answers with a snug whisper, the kind of fit a museum catalog calls well-matched and the small. Joy of the closure admits that even a myth needs proper storage if it is to serve more than a single night. Norse legends pass through the mind like a cool wind, one wide wisdom purchased at a well-end. The comparison sharpens. The Roman preference for delegation, where a northern god sacrifices an eye. A Roman goddess seems to lend hers out, expecting a full return and a report. Another mainstream anchor keeps the coil from drifting. Museums preserve countless lidded boxes and blown bottles from the Roman world, testifying to lives lived among small containers and precise rituals, an urban heroism made of lids set well and breath decanted carefully. The bizarre detail flickers again in the glass. For a heartbeat, each orb shows a tiny lamp flame doubled within, like eyes watching back with the room's own light, and the effect is neither sinister nor kind, only confident, as if the tools know their job. Imagine the deities convening over such boxes on domestic altars, a quiet congress where Venus watches over scent, Libitina over parting, and a Greek queen's insomnia becomes Rome's omnivision, each goddess agreeing that a well-kept pyxis is as respectable as a well-kept oath. You study the note as line again traded sleep for sight-hand. The psychology is plain as a ledger. Rest was impossible, so vision was reorganized, and somewhere in that reorganization, a city learned to love boxes not for secrecy, but for accuracy. A second paper scrap almost translucent with oil bears a single instruction returned before dawn, and that is the phrase that makes the scalp cool because it implies a lender's right to call in the gaze, a curfew for seeing that even a strix must heed if it wants the contract renewed. Greek mythology nods with its old grace, acknowledging that omnivision without rest becomes torment, and torment without function becomes chaos, while Rome raises a hand that says, measure it, schedule it, ring a bell at the right hour, and lay the tools in wood that will not warp overnight. Outside, the owl calls once, and the sound feels more like a docket number than a threat. A reminder that the night's appetites often prefer paperwork to drama when a household proves it can meet a circulating gaze with a steady place to sleep between assignments. You place the pixies back where the dust ring remembers it, and the lamp's cone slides off the lid like a seal pressed to wax. An authorization that reassures the wrist more than the heart, and that is enough for now in this city of heroes and deities and ancient mysteries. What would you do if a neighbor's lamp stayed lit past midnight and a voice called softly from their doorway to ask whether the eyes in the box might be borrowed for 1 hour, to find a missing breath that refuses to answer its name. But the question that remained was whether omnivision divided into orbs, boxed between perfumes. Time to a dawn can never be returned clean, whether every borrowed night leaves a film on the glass that the goddess must drink before she can sleep at all. You step beneath a trellised arch where grapes hang like amethyst bells, their skins shining with the evening's last breath, and the murmur through the leaves sounds like 1,000 soft toasts rising toward Venus, while a shadowed altar waits for Libitina to lift the same cup. The scent is a weave of musk, myrtle, and warm resin, and a priestess raises a chalice whose rim wears a wreath of vine tendrils, inviting the crowd to taste sweetness with the same composure they will someday offer to the grove that counts farewells. A mainstream truth steadies the hand that receives the first pour. Rome held wine festivals Vinalia Urbana in spring and Vinalia Rustica near harvest rites that honored Venus and Jupiter with grapes and pressed juice, the city's way of measuring pleasure in dates and libations. Another truth crosses the plaza like a hush under song. Libitina, the funerary goddess whose grove recorded deaths and arranged the pampa, has long been named beside ledgers, and undertakers making sorrow as administrable as a vintage, carefully cellared for its appointed day. You watch as the priestess speaks the name Venus Libitina, and although scholars argue over the epithet's origins, the title passes through the crowd like a chord that feels true in the bones yoking love and burial in one cup, without spilling either down the city's sleeve. A marginal scribe-esque caution flickers at the edge of hearing, beware the confusion of Libitina with Venus. Lubentia, he mutters, but the festival refuses to untie the knot, and the names chime together like twin.
Oh.
Platner's old catalog remembers a temple of Venus within or near the Libertinian Grove, a topographical proximity that smells less like error than like economy. As if Rome placed sweetness and stillness under branches that could shade both without offense, the bizarre detail is a wine blessing no one admits directly. A handful of grapes are pricked, so the juice beads like dark blood on the skins, then tipped onto the earth in a neat line, as if the ground should taste rehearsal before the household must. A chorus of girls with myrtle in their hair hums a line about beauty that outlasts a season, and the refrain tilts toward the undertaker's precinct almost imperceptibly, turning the melody into a bridge between benches of lovers and benches set before tomb facades. Miano's lucid pages linger behind the priestess's voice, reminding that Libitina often functions as a metonym for the entire apparatus of death, which makes this toast to Venus Libitina read like gratitude for systems that soothe the living even as they honor the dead. The amphora-bearers alternate pours, one for Venus's rose-sweet altars, one for the grove that kept the register, and with each tilt, the crowd seems to accept that Rome knows how to pour meanings without mixing them into mud. A mainstream anchor hums beneath the song when the city celebrated Venus's favorite blessed vines, lovers, and adornment, and when the city turned toward Libitina, it blessed the passage, the ledgers, and the choreography that keeps a hard day from shattering the dishes. In the lantern-fretted dusk, a matron ties a sprig of myrtle to a funerary wreath and murmurs that beauty should supervise endings as well as beginnings, a household theology that neither priest nor magistrate disturbs because it keeps the pulse even. The priestess lifts the chalice again and calls the grape a teacher of moderation, a fruit that can cure or cloud depending on measure, and the line feels like a civics lesson when aimed at a city that survived by assigning hours to joy and schedules to grief. Greek mythology leans into the square with its easy eloquence. Aphrodite glows in the rose-scented smoke yet. The Roman tempo insists on method, and so the toast includes an aside about the priceless at the grove, the bureaucracy that holds panic by the hand and walks it home. A quirky custom rides the rim of the cup. A few families drop a coin into the wine, kiss the metal, then rinse it in a basin near the altar, as if reminding Venus that Libitina's chest once sounded like hail, and that the city prefers quiet weather in numbers as well as in clouds. A girl scatters grapeskins in a narrow line down the paving stones to the gate, explaining in a whisper that the strix dislikes treading on empty sweetness, and the superstition lands softly, the way rumors do when they make the nervous feel included instead of alone. The priestess names the harvest by date and deity Jupiter for weather, Venus for ripeness, and the cadence resembles an inventory more than a hymn, a Roman style that makes the gods feel present because the verbs keep their backs straight. A mainstream note steadies the ear. Epigraphers and antiquarians have long recorded how Venus and wine keep company at the Vinalia, and how gardens meant more than ornament, places where desire and cultivation learned to share. Trellises under a watchful sky, Libitina's grove by contrast, lent cypress shade to undertakers and mourners. And the double image is not contradiction but a diptych, a pair of panels that hinge on the same law of care for vessels, one for living blood and one for wine that pretends its warmth. In the pause between toasts, an old man mutters that during Nero's plague, even Venus kept silent at the cup. And the crowd follows his glance toward a ledger resting under cloth. The book of household dead that families bring like a second offering to the night. The bizarre detail from the far edge of the square is a garlanded bier propped upright and empty, decorated with roses. And vine leaves a theatrical prop for rehearsing gratitude that someday the weight it carries will be gentled by song and steady shoulders. Britannica's clipped claws as Libitina, as funerary goddess. The grove is register and supply hover in the lamplight like a modest credo. And the crowd drinks, with the poise of citizens who respect footnotes as much as thunderbolts. A young couple ties a myrtle cord between their wrists and sips once, then drapes the same cord over a wreath. Small wreath hung near the precinct gate, trusting that a shared sip offered to both deities teaches the future to behave inside its proper lanes. Greek mythology lifts a brow at the ritual's neatness, but then nods, because even in tales of heroes, the best outcomes come to those who honor both appetites. And endings, while Norse legends rumble faintly about cups, in halls where memory and mead keep the dead seated among the living. Miano's argument resumes like a gentle drum. The epithet Venus Libitina is less an error than a reflection of how, Romans thought, how language, place, and function converged until a goddess could legitimately wear two duties without breaking stride. The priestess pours the last measure into a shallow dish and tips it toward the earth. A libation for anyone listening beneath, and for a moment, the festival feels like a treaty ratified in grape and breath, with seals impressed by petals instead of wax. A mother presses a grape into a child's hand and says, "Taste. So you'll recognize the day we taste for someone who cannot," and the sentence becomes a quiet contract that the city would like to hold on file indefinitely. A quirky superstition flickers at the margin. If the crescent of spilled wine points toward the grove, the year will lean to funerals. If it points toward the vineyards, the year will favor weddings. If it points between, both shall proceed without scandal. You lift the chalice and smell rose, resin, and dark sugar, and the breath feels like a message addressed to no single deity and to all of them at once. A statement that the city prefers shared custody of fragile goods, love, bodies, and time. The mainstream anchor holds through the applause. Abundant literary and antiquarian testimony places Venus among wine and gardens, and Libitina among groves and ledgers. And the crossing of their names at a festival becomes a civic poem that allows fear to sit down without demanding a chair of its own. Somewhere a lone owl threads the air above the cypress, and though a dozen heads tilt, no one stops pouring. Even the strix must find its leverage without interrupting the count of toasts because ritual renders rumor polite in front of witnesses. Greek mythology lingers in the way the priestess tilts the cup, as if Aphrodite herself were timing the pour, while Roman habit ensures the spill reaches a marked stone laid precisely where libations should pool. Proof that grace and geometry can complement each other without rivalry. The chalice cools in the evening, and the crowd is hummed decrescendos into the soft shuffling of sandals, a civic diminuendo that keeps the night's pulse low enough for the city's dreams to remember their lines. What would you do if during a final toast a feather drifted down into the cup and the surface closed over it like a lens, silvering with moonlight as if to suggest some gaze had joined the drink to see how mortals mix sweetness and farewells? But the question that remained was whether naming Venus Libitina out loud truly braids love and death into one chalice or merely announces the city. So this ambition to schedule even the unschedulable land invites the gods to honor the calendar that mortals keep. You unfold a rain-smudged letter from a legionary posted beyond the iron gates, and the ink has run just enough to make the phrases breathe like a cold fog. On the St. S night, the strigoi rise and blue fires walk the graves lines that make Ammonia's fears suddenly wear a new dialect shaped by mountains and fir. He writes from the province of Dacia, where the Danube hardens into discipline, reminding that the empire annexed these hills and mines after Trajan's wars, then garrisoned roads while free Dacians and Sarmatians tested the borders with raids and rumors that travel faster than horses. A mainstream truth steadies the pulse as the letter S breath reaches the reader. In Romanian tradition, the strigoi are troubled spirits said to rise from graves or live among the living under a curse. A folklore line that threads from village fires into written accounts as a local legend that refuses to retire. He notes the villagers' calendar in a jot cramped by weather. The night of St. Andrew at the turn of November is when bad spirits cross, when garlic is rubbed on doors, and when wolves and the dead stand closer to the hearth than law would prefer. Another hand has annotated the margin in a steadier script. Moroi and Precalici are named cousins to the strigoi in village speech, shape-shifting threats that join the ASEA. This parade of ancient mysteries that a Roman ear can file only by listening more slowly than usual. Imagine you are on the sacred mountain of empire's certainty. Then step down into this frontier hamlet where deities are as near as the chimney smoke, and consider how Greek mythology's clear profiles soften into local weather, the names learning a colder wind before entering a Roman mouth. The letter devotes a line to procedure because soldiers cannot help themselves. Doors and windows smeared with garlic iron pins set in lintels. In bowls of water set by thresholds on St. Andrew's Eve, a domestic defense against intruders who travel by rumor as much as by footprint. He adds a note that makes the scalp cool in any century. A blue fire sometimes hovers over bog and burial at night like a patient candle with no hand to hold it, a phenomenon. The locals call it ghost light, and the legion names ignis fatuus when wanting to sound learned. Elsewhere, Scaula's explanation trails the letter with a modern camuelo. The wisps may be methane-cool flames. A light from decaying matter, tiny microlightning in the air setting blue kisses on the damp where travelers mistake science for spirits at the bend of a path. The letter says that on nights when the blue fires walk the ground, the strigoi are easier to believe, especially when voices scratch at shutters, and a voice known in life seems to ask for the old cup by name, an ache no spear can face down without the help of a household rite. A quirky detail stirs from the same page: the wolf the old. Dacian totem prowls the village's mind in late autumn, and on St. Andrew's night the howling is an oracle for the year to come, a chorus that makes even. Legionaries listen for whether their own tents will keep order against the cold. He circles the line back to policy with a soldier's neatness. The men trust garlic, iron, and a neat stack of shields, while the villagers trust names, St. Andrew's Rest. And the old Dacian belief that this is a New Year S-gate, where things cross without asking. A mainstream anchor returns to hold the narrative steady. Strigoi lore catalogs living and dead type Strigo V and Strigo Morcasols, who sap strength, steal milk, and thread harm through kinship. A description that meshes too well with frontier anxiety to be ignored by men who count rations and rumors with equal care. The letter claims that blue lights sometimes pool over fresh mounds after rain, little wavering tongues no taller than a sword pommel, and that locals take them as warnings or signatures rather than as weather, a difference of grammar that merits attention when patrolling between stones. It would be easy to laugh in a warmer city until a blue flame hovers where a new name lies and does not move. And the legionary's next line wisely resists mockery, recording instead what is done. Set iron at the foot, smear the lintel, keep the bulla on the child's sleep-in shifts. Greek mythology drifts into the letter's edge as if to explain calmly that cultures always asks for the same intruder, and that heroes on the frontier must learn to translate the local chorus into a cadence legible to deities who do not recognize a prefect S stamp. He mentions briefly that St. Andrew's Eve is like a local Halloween, not in jest but in calendar logic. A hinge night when spirits cross households. Stand watch and garlic becomes a sacrament practical enough for soldiers to adopt without feeling. They have abandoned Rome. At the bottom of the page, a smear of river silt darkens the word for fire, and to a later reader it looks as if the letter itself has picked up a touch of blue the way lamplight can leak into ink when the hand that writes is shaking more from listening than from cold. A mainstream line holds the page fast. Roman Dacia was administered and fortified, yet never entirely quiet a province whose frontier has made every rumor part of the logistics because supplies and calm travel the same roads and both fail when panic breeds faster than accounts. He adds a soldier's humor about deities to keep courage from cracking if the blue fires are Mars' night signals. Then the patrol will assume they mark dry ground rather than graves, but the joke fades, and he writes, instead of wax crumbling under a name the wind keeps trying to blow out, Another line folds Norse legends into his own daydream during oblique watch ravens on a one-eyed god. S shoulders and funeral mounds under frost reminding that heroes learn to share weather across myths. Because cold teaches a discipline that makes rumor less dangerous at dawn. He reports a village woman who counts the flames and predicts the winter, and though the cohort mocks gently, the centurion records it in the log, because any metric might steady a week where the granary feels smaller after the owls have screamed twice in one night. A quirky afterimage clings to the last lines. The wolf-linked night of St. Andrew is the only evening when horses are said to see what men refuse, and a stable boy ties garlic to thee. Bridle not for luck, but to make the animal believe the world is properly numbered. He writes almost as an apology that Greek mythology in the schools never mentioned this much garlic or this many small blue. Candles and that deities on the frontier seem to prefer whispers to proclamations, a policy Rome might consider adopting during the darker weeks. A final mainstream point seals the leaf. Strigoi traditions include nights when the dead are restless and doors must be smeared and watched. And the St. Andrew Vigil is such a hinge, a shared understanding that households can enforce without new laws, because the old ones start in the chest. He closes with inventory and breath count, as soldiers do so many lamps, so many pins, so many cloves. So many prayers, and the blue fire returns as a cold parenthesis in the margin, neither deniable nor decisive, only present enough to be scheduled in the night's patrol. The letter's wax is pressed with a smudged legionary stamp, and the impression looks like a helmet peering through smoke. An image that ages well as the reader imagines deities glancing down and accepting the balance of garlic and courage without complaint. When the lamp is lowered, a faint blue echo seems to hang above the parchment like breath in winter, and whether it is oil. Fume or ignis fatuus matters less than the coordination of hands that have learned to meet each night with both ritual and a carefully sharpened calm. Heroes in every tradition eventually learn to serve the border between fear and form, and this letter reads like a small manual for that service. A quiet set of steps anyone can follow. Listen to the old names, mark the blue fires, keep garlic near the hinge, count everyone twice. What would you do if, during the saint's night, a blue flame paused above a mound where a friend lay, and the garlic stung the hands? Would the next order be to call it a gas and carry on, or to bow long enough for the deities to feel the heart slow and the patrol remember how to breathe? You return to the Esquiline gate, where the arch of Gallienus holds its breath like a jawbone in the Servian wall, and the stones seem to remember. Every entry bargain the city ever dared to speak at a threshold guarded by law, wind, and rumor. The arch is not a triumph so much as a hinge remade in the Augustan age and rededicated in Gallienus' crisis. A gate that keeps both memory and rewording as its professions. And tonight it waits for a pact spoken so quietly that only Cyprus and Ledger will overhear. A mainstream truth sets the ground under the feet. This is the old, or Porta Esquilina of the Servian. While the easting where, via Labicana and Tiburtina, once began a gate that opened toward Puticuli and later toward Maecenas' gardens, making entrances carry both burden and perfume. Just beyond, the Lucas of Libitina once gave undertakers their precinct. The grove where designators arranged farewells and coins fell into a temple chest that taught sorrow to keep time. The very place a city might propose a covenant to what it fears and depends upon. You set a hand on the travertine, and the chill is administrative, not hostile like a clerk's calm before a long line. And the night seems to adjust its weight so words can fit without bending because a pact is an instrument that prefers quiet to thunder. The proposal is simple as a funerary tariff and twice as hard to enforce. Guard the dead, spare the living keep, the strix at the boundary of breath, and ledger let the owl. Be a librarian. Above the grove and not a collector in bedrooms where lamps burn low. A mainstream anchor steadies the voice in the throat, the Servian wall. Esquiline gate once overlooked unhealthy ground in Republican days, and later the Horty. Refinements proving thresholds can be retuned, and that retuning has always been Rome's most pious craft. You place an offering that matches the request and tone a knotted red thread and a pinch of myrrh in a small bowl set upon the arch. Sledge because small vows are more legible to deities who manage crowds and inventories rather than thunderbolts alone. The bizarre detail is a feather laid flat to the stone pinned by a bronze nail etched with a fig sign not to harm a bird, but to sign the knight's receipt a legal fiction fit for a city that hires grammar to do its heaviest lifting. From the dark of the gateway the air answers with the lightest pressure, the way a ledger corners a page to keep it from turning too fast, and you understand that bargains with deities here are accepted in increments, an index finger placed on a moving sum. A mainstream fact returns with a lift of lamp. The Arches rededication to Gallienus in 262 came from Aurelius Victor, a PR embedded in stone to balance calamity, which is another kind of pact politics asking architecture to tutor memory into gentleness. You speak the names that make the request. Thinkable Libitina for order, Venus for gardens, the Strix for rumor. Mycenas for cover so the agreement can be triangulated among deities, undertakers, owls, and terraces a chorus. Rome recognizes as sober enough to last. Just outside the gate's shadow the old Ager once swelled like a rib beneath the city's skin. And gates here learn to breathe in siege and peace alike. So a covenant about breath drafted at this hinge feels precisely suited to the place where roads begin and end. From the grove, an almost imagined bell taps once for pollution and once for permission. The same notes that balance processions and ledgers, and the arch which has seen inscriptions scraped and replaced, holds a silence that behaves like assent without promising absolution. The wind carries a cinder scent from a brazier and the owls. Cloth tear call shears the air, but the sound lands on the far side of the line, as if the mask you hung earlier still turns in the cypress. Sockets catching borrowed eyes that prefer to count rather than harvest. Where Greek mythology looks on with its adaptable calm gods have sworn worse bargains at narrower doors and the arch, Augustan bones. Remember how reuse makes sanctity durable? How a gateway can become a treaty stone when spoken to like a colleague, not a trophy. A quirky token rests on the impost. A tiny oscilla cut from thin marble, featureless and round, drilled to hang, and you let it swing once with a finger so the pact can learn a rhythm. The way a house learns the weight of a new key on the same hook. Mainstream context draws the circle tight. Undertakers operated from Libitina's grove, registering deaths and supplying rites. Which means the city already practices part of the pact: each day guard the dead with competence, so the living can sleep a covenant by another name. Beyond the arch Mycenas's gardens once covered, the pits and a terrace is also a treaty, a layer of care over crisis. To renew that treaty aloud is not innovation so much as maintenance, the most Roman form of piety measured in well-fitted stones. You add a second clause without raising the voice. If blue fires walk the graves on winter hinge, let them be counted lights, not lures. If the strix rides the breeze, let its wings escort, not steal. If fear arrives, let it take a number and wait its turn. The arch's inscription, altered in Gallienus's trouble, has room enough above it where removed slabs once hung, and the blankness functions as a signature line. The night seems to place a name there in invisible ink, while the breeze dries an agreement no chisel will ever see. A mainstream note affirms the setting. Its credentials. The Esquiline gate became a single great arch that survives near San Vito, a relic of movement and management, not theatrical victory, which is why pacts about breadth and boundaries feel native to its shadow. Norse legends drift by with frost-quiet counsels, spoken under arches last like iron, if measured, and the comparison gives the words a colder edge that Rome appreciates when rumor wants heat and the city wants hinges. The bizarre detail returns as if to test your steadiness. A moth lands on the bronze nail through the feather and does not move. A living punctuation mark that makes the moment feel filed rather than performed. Exactly the tone a goddess of funerals expects from mortals who request exceptions. You step back from the gate and listen for any change in the strix's patience, and hear only the ordinary drift of night, the kind of silence that undertakers rely on when carts roll, a practical quiet that sounds like permission to proceed without ceremony. Mainstream memory keeps the balance. This threshold has supervised departures to roads and rites for centuries, and its survival through rededications proves that Rome believes in amendments more than abolitions, a jurisprudence suited to pacts that must be renewed with every dusk. Greek mythology inclines the head, and the arch does not crack, and the grove does not flare, and the mask continues to turn unseen. And in that lack of spectacle, the covenant becomes plausible. Guard the dead, spare the living, hold the night to its own best manners. What would you do if tomorrow an undertaker reported fewer feathers on doorsteps and more on the cypress? And a clerk at the grove wrote, "Received." In a margin no one had taught him to annotate. Would you call it providence, or just a city remembering how to make weather behave? But the question that remained was whether the Senate city of deities can keep such a pact longer than one season, or whether the arch that has learned erasures and insertions will one night accept a darker rededication from a hunger that prefers clauses written on breath. You unroll a narrow sheaf of parchment in a scriptorium that smells of ink, soot, and sheepskin. The first line calls a woman striga, in the charge and strix in the margin. It's if the clerk's hand could not tell where feather ends and spell begins without writing both on the same breath. The transcript reads like a corridor between centuries Latin that knows Roman streets but leans toward church doors, accusing night flight shapeshifting and theft of warmth. A bill of particulars that lists injuries a household can count by the hour more easily than a magistrate can number in law. A mainstream truth steadies the pulse as the letters crowd the lamp. S circle. Daniel Ogden's Dacia shows how Latin strix and striga braided across time, owl and witch sharing appetite and method so that literature and accusation could point to the same neighbor with different syllables in one dread. A gloss and a precise later hand cites the canon episcopi bishops. Must labor to uproot magic, it says, and women who claim to ride by night with Diana or Herodias are deceived by phantasm, not sinew. So belief itself becomes a heresy that must be penanced even when bodies never left the bed. The text quotes the canon core warning, Do not relapse into pagan error by crediting flights with a goddess S-train. And teach everywhere that such visions are illusions the adversary inspires, a policy that shrinks miles of night into inches of doctrine and still leaves shutters trembling. A quirky detail clings to the parchment-est edge like a snagged feather the scribe. His quill is cut from an owl's wing and trimmed to a fig-leaf nib, a tool that writes down witchcraft flights while betraying a superstition about implements that no rubric dares to name aloud. Another mainstream anchor tilts the page toward an older courtroom. In Roman Africa, Apulus stands accused of using love magic to win a widow, the apology preserving a rare defense. From a magic trial and proving how law listened when rumor dressed itself in evidence and oaths, his speech parries the word beneficium with natural philosophy and wit, a navigational chart for defendants who must convince judges that incantations are merely poetry with bad timing, and that potions are curiosities misread by angry kin and the ancient mysteries of inheritance. The transcript in your hand does not reach that eloquence. It catalogues nitrides and breath thefts with a severity borrowed from church pens, as if the strix of Esquiline alleys had been promoted or demoted into a heresy examinable by men with ink and pastoral questions. A side note, in cramped script whispers that Burchard of Worms incorporated the canon into his decree, and in corrector the episcopal interrogatory that asks whether penitents profess to ride at night, to consort with Diana or Herodias, or to believe that bodies change into birds, and prescribes penance for the belief more than the deed. Burchard's corrector reads like a physician's form. Do you think yourself carried? Do you trample vineyards by spirit flight? Do you bind milk by words? And the answer keys weigh years of penance, turning striga into a pastoral algebra that solves panic without ever seeing a feather. A mainstream line keeps the corridor straight. The canon episcopi's core position denies the physical reality of nocturnal flights and metamorphoses, branding them delusions and warning that even believing such stories reopens the door to pagan reverence for wandering goddesses. The margin equating striga and strix does not contradict that canon so much as it translates it, folding the Roman bird into the Christian courtroom so that one term covers both the appetite and the alleged operator, and the pen can keep pace with terror by reducing synonyms to one sin. You imagine the scribe's hand hesitating before he writes Diana, then adding Herodias and a fainter ink, a compromise that lets an old goddess and a new villain share a line, and the parchment seems to flutter like a startled wing that cannot decide whether to rise or fold. Ogden's pages echo through the room, which has become strigoi, and vice versa, in poems and invectivons. Suddenly the transcript feels less like a unique case than a junction where literature bled into protocol in a household. Insomnia became a bishop's questionnaire. From Rome's older file, Ovid's Lemuria rises with its beans fig sign and ninefold clang on copper, an ancient method for appeasing restless dead that prefigures the later pastoral turn. Assign words and counters to fear, teach hands what to do when eyelids do nothing to stop the noise in the ribs. A clerk at the side table scratches a note about Thessalian sagae in the Apulus tradition, which is feared for eclipse magic and corpse robbing, showing how classical allegations and medieval interrogations share a spine, even when the vertebrae are labeled with different vowels. Mainstream caution follows like a second pen. Apuleius' case is the rare surviving magical trial speech, not a witch hunt record. The surviving canonical texts emphasize correcting beliefs and penance rather than bonfires, an administrative style that still lets fear file its complaint. The bizarre artifact appears when the notary opens a leather wallet and removes a tiny lead strip stamped with characters. It's not to curse, but to mark a cross-reference, even in a trial about flights. A shrunken echo of curse tablets finds work as a filing tag that reassures the hand more than the heart. You read a line that counts witnesses of a night ride and realize the canon episcopi would convict the testimony, not the woman deeming the witnesses heretics of credulity and sentencing belief to instruction the way a physician sentences fever to blankets and time. Burchard's corrector then intervenes like a schoolmaster. How many nights? What formula? With Human, the arithmetic of penance reads like a schedule to bleed panic without starving the community. A pastoral engineering that retools the Roman habit of procedure for a new register. Greek mythology leans in at the edge with an arched brow. If a goddess once loaned her name to night processions of women, the new law now calls the parade a dream and assigns it confession hours, so that metamorphosis is repackaged as catechusis and fear must answer in prose. Apuleius's cool voice drifts back over the scribe's shoulders, reminding that law can be theater when rumor wants blood. Yet reason in court can make even fish speak for the defendant, a tactic that belongs to any city that prefers argument to torches. A mainstream thread stitches the pages together. The Roman strix and the medieval striga share a conceptual, nest night's breath flight milk infants, so it is not surprising that a transcript equates the terms compressing bird in which into a single docket to keep the hearing from splitting in two. The clerk's owl quill, bizarrely apt, keeps clicking against the margin as if the instrument disapproves of the content. A metronome of claws on vellum that turns doctrine into a sound the chest recognizes as authority without deciding whether to obey. Somewhere behind the wall, a novice rehearses the canon episcopi. Insipid bishops and their ministers should by all means eradicate the pernicious art of magic hand. The echo reminds that for all the denials, a city never truly erases the night. It merely redraws the routes by which fear may speak. You hold the parchment up to the lamp and see scraped places where names were. Lifted damnatio memoria in miniature showing that trials can erase as deftly as arches a palimpsest of accusation in which the gap shouts louder than the ink. The mainstream anchor returns to Rome's earlier bench, literature like Horace S. Canidia shows witchcraft as a civic worry and a comic terror, while the later canon law texts discipline the same terror into penances proving. Continuity of dread across different desks and signatures. A quirky seal hangs from the transcript, red wax stamped with a tiny owl, and cross-and no one remarks on the collision. Why? Tools of office have always learned to wear two faces when a city decides to speak to. Languages of the same insomnia without losing its douceur. Greek mythology nods once more toward Diana, whose nightly train the canon demotes to dream. The goddess steps sideways into a footnote while the strix of Latin verse enters a rubric as striga, and even the scribe's pen seems to understand that Rome survives by writing carefully where others shout. What would you do if a witness swore to feathers on the windowsill and a bishop swore to illusions in the head? Would the verdict weigh the sill or the skull? Who would certify the breath when both law and rumor claim to have found the knight's signature on the same cold pane? You sit with a candle and a stack of footnotes, while a cautious voice on the page confesses that Libitina might be less a person than a position, less a goddess than a metonym for the city's whole apparatus of funerals. And the neat crest of certainty on the scalp cracks like old plaster above a cool, well-kept room. The scholar's claim is methodical rather than cruel. Red Libitina is a liminal word, a name that stood at the edge of Rome Esquiline groves. Undertakers' ledgers, suburban rites, and then slipped inward to stand for the entire choreography of mourning, a semantic promotion that looks like deification from a distance. A mainstream truth steadies the hand that turns the page. The very Latin admits it, because Libitina can function as a metonym for death in Roman. Texts a usage ancient writers and lexica preserve with the same dry confidence they give to taxes and roads. Britannica, sober and spare, keeps a line open for doubt by noting that Libitina was often mistakenly identified with Venus Lubentia, an Italian garden goddess, and that the funerary deity may originally have been an earth goddess whose precinct and personnel later defined her more than myths did. An old encyclopedia entry places her Lucas on the Esquiline near sites with ill-omened air and a public cemetery. Sketching a geographic argument, the place and its function drew the name into a role so comprehensive that later readers mistook role for biography. The scholar whose paper you mark in the margin makes it a principle, metonymy explains. A beta semantics and her liminal location outside. The walls at the gate among cypress shade and priceless smears, a liminal status in Roman. Polytheism practice scarce in myth. You let the thought unspool into a cooler air. If this goddess is a function, then the shrine was an office, the coin a receipt. The designator, a priest of logistics, and the grove escrows the only choristers required for a religion that wanted accuracy more than thunder. Varro's habit of etymology creeps into the footnotes like ivy linking Libitina to libet and libido, sliding her toward Venus Lubentina in a dance of letters that antiquarians loved, while later compilers repeat the association with an even hand that refuses to blush. A quirky gloss from a modern database recites alternate threads with untroubled patience. Venus Verticordia supervises upright hearts and sexual reform. Venus Libitina tones the garden toward the grave in Varro. Theology smooths the braid as if the city always preferred its opposites to share a hairpin. The confession thickens in the best possible way when a recent article about prefixing nods to the metonym, to explaining that the women hired to lead lament belonged to an economy tied to Libitina, and that her very name could mean death itself, a linguistic proof of an administrative sanctity. A mainstream anchor fixes to the desk like a paperweight. Primary sources do record a grove of Libitina, a death coin, a registry, and undertakers, which means the cult's infrastructure is not an hypothesis, but an observable ligament connecting city and silence. Across the column, K. Cave Zulof's essay whispers that Venus Libitina is a felt alignment of love and death Lib, and Todd a durable intuition rather than an error, suggesting that the city's poetry kept finding the goddess at crossroads where vines and beers exchange courtesies. If both claims stand metonym and marriage, then the plaster cracks only to reveal brick, not air. The goddess may be a title worn by a place function, and the title may have annexed Venus's precinct by a logic older than etymologies. The logic that households use when they lay wreaths in gardens before funerals. Wikipedia's compact dossier, for all its brevity, preserves the double view. Libitina is funerary goddess, and as metonym for death, her grove on the Esquiline. Her tax for the register, and even the staggering note that in a plague season 30,000 deaths were entered at her shrine, an arithmetic that makes grammar sweat. A mainstream detail returns with unblinking calm. Varro's line in Tapas text equates Venus Libitina, pliant delight with Libitina, equipment of funerals as if an antiquarian had filed both under a single drawer labeled hinges where beginnings and endings share brass. The antiquarian confession does not erase the owl that has been following you. It teaches the bird a desk and a stipend the way a city trains whether to behave by giving it hours and a ledger. While the goddess becomes a patient rubric for tasks the living will not abandon. A quirky aside bubbles up from a late antique essay on antiquarian method, reminding that scholars in every age invent ancestors for their categories, and that a late Roman talent for filing the past sometimes created deities the way a clerk creates departments by assigning work and stamping a name. You test the plaster crack with a fingertip, and the wall holds, because even if Libitina is a function wearing a face, the function still answers when called, and households still sleep better when someone owns the night. Checklists in a grove within walking distance of grief. A mainstream truth keeps your seat from wobbling. Metonymic deities are not unheard of in Roman religion, where Victoria, Salus, and Concordia can behave like departments of state and still receive flowers like persons. Their temples functioning as offices where virtues clock in. Britannica's caution about Venus Lubentia feels less like scolding and more like a librarian's finger to the lips. Mind the file tabs. Do not shelve a garden goddess on a funerary shelf without noting the cross-references. Let the city keep both books open on the same table. The 1911 entry's insistence on the Grove's geography becomes an ethics in your ear. Put the precinct on the map. The rest will follow the coin, the ledger. The undertakers, because in Rome, places an argument that outlives etymologies and reconciles them when they quarrel. Miano's metonym returns to the center line, liminal deity, liminal place, liminal semantics. And you realize that the confession does not shrink the goddess. It spreads her across everything the city must do when a breath stops, letting language dignify labor without faking a myth. A quirky detail clings to the page as someone has doodled a laurel around the word. Libitina, as if to crown a job title, and you cannot help smiling at the Roman impulse to award wreaths to competent nouns. A habit that may be the city's strangest and most enduring magic. Mainstream links accumulate on the desk like coins in a bowl. The Lucco's undertakers, the register's plague, tallied the confusion with Venus, the Esquiline. Unhealthy reputation. Each citation holds a corner of a truth that does not need miracles to feel holy. Postex S. Varro returns once more to remind that even ancient pedants loved to fold desire and departure into one etymological purse. A linguistic thrift that makes the metonym feel less like invention and more like the way people actually speak when the room is dark and the task is delicate. What would you do if a priest admitted during a midnight council that he serves a department more than a deity, that his goddess is a duty wearing a wreath and asked whether the comfort offered by an organized kindness feels thinner than the comfort offered by a face. But the question that remained was whether calling Libitina a metonym robs the night of its goddess, or finally tells the truth Rome always practiced, that a city of heroes and deities prefers a well-run office at the gate, and that the most faithful ritual is sometimes a ledger balanced without trembling hands. You kneel over a shallow trench on the Esquiline, as dusk lays a violet film across the soil, and the first trowel scrape lifts a breath of dry earth that smells faintly of lime and ash, the same palette that once colored Puticuli where the city stacked endings into squared mouths of ground. The trench edges show the old stratography like a layered ledger fill over fill. Cinder overclaimed even before the lamp is set, the hill's biography begins to speak in fragments that match what histories keep insisting about this slope-turned-necropolis-turned-garden. A mainstream truth anchors the hand that brushes dust from a sherd. The Esquiline necropolis stretched here in archaic and early periods, later overlain by the Horti of Mycenas, a civic transformation. Allowed promenades to walk over pits without forgetting the pits were there. Your spoon flicks a coin from a seam of ochre sand, and when it spins in the lamplight it looks like a tiny moon risen on schedule. The very image of the funeral coin that Roman funerary practice made ordinary Annibal with a duty to attend a parting even when no one speaks of Charon by name. Another mainstream detail steadies the breath as the coin warms in the palm. Death was registered in Libitina. Grove and a fee or coin entered the shrine, chest linking metal to memory, administration to absence, and creating the odd tenderness that grows when a city counts its dead carefully. The soil sifts again and yields a small avian phalanx pale as paper under lamplight, and though bone without context says little to law, the mind cannot help hearing an owl and its silhouette, because Rome trained the ear to read the night bird as omen long before archaeologists learned the names of every toe. Owls in Roman imagination were unquiet portents, noon calls, warning of disaster. Night voices that turned shudders into instruments, so a single bird bone harmless in itself drags a rumor. Wade across the trench and asks whether the strix ever perched where the cypresses refuse to move. You lay the phalanx by the coin, and the pairing behaves like a sentence. The hill has been waiting to speak money for passage and a bird for appetite, to nouns that summarize a century of anxiety more efficiently than any decree etched in bronze. The next flicker is metal again, but broader. A thin crescent of bronze with a softened bevel where fingers once steadied it. A mirror shard that reflects the lamp as a tarnished sun, enough to prove how often Roman burials tucked household objects beside their sleepers for company and for memory's touch. A mainstream fact keeps the find from floating into fancy grave goods in Roman practice could include tools, lamps, vessels, and adornments, so a bronze mirror fragment in this soil is no marvel, but a domestication of sorrow, a way to let the dead keep a familiar gesture near the wrist. You think briefly of the Esquiline treasure, the great hoard of silver and fashion that surfaced not far from here, and although the mirror you hold is humble, the glint connects this ground to a tradition of metal, speaking softly about households that once set pride and grief on the same shelf. A quirky glimmer runs across the mirror's back, where a scratch has outlived its maker, a line that approaches the geometry of characters. Known from the Greek magical papyrus, those tiny star claws and letter knots used to coax attention from powers who prefer their mail folded in symbols. You do not pretend the scratch proves a ritual, but it behaves like a memory of one, a reminder that this city learned early how to ask thin metals to carry heavy messages, from cursed tablets rolled in wells to inscriptions brushed on stucco lids where names waited to be touched. The trench begins to look like a modest still life. Coin, bird bone, mirror shard, a triangle of testimony arranged by gravity rather than by design, yet eloquent enough to call back procedures and rumors from above the registry in the grove. The owls clothed her cry, the lamp trimmed at bedsides that did not sleep. A mainstream thread runs through it all like a chalkline: Esquiline burial grounds, then Mycenas' terraces, then the long afterlife of fines that force the mind to read civic policy and street gossip in the same breath, because the hill refuses to separate what the living tried to file in different drawers. You test the soil near the coin and lift a rim, of course, where blackened inside. A kitchen amphora's cousin that once carried something useful. and funerary practice makes that humble residue a blessing, as if people knew the dead prefer familiarity over grandeur when darkness presses close. On a hunch from the bone and the rumor, it invites you think of the strix that Roman literature pinned to the night, a vampire bird with a knack for slipping into niches where the lamplight thins, and the trench suddenly feels like a quiet porch where hunger once paused to check its manners. You do not find feathers. You find a thread of red wool hardened by earth, the same color families sometimes tied at thresholds and wrists, a domestic apotropaic that rhymes exactly with the city. This way of turning fear into something people can touch, and not without confessing defeat. A mainstream anchor keeps the scene steady. Defixiones and household charms traveled the same road's lead sheets, binding tongues and fates in wells, while simple threads protected cots and doors too. Grammars of control that taught breath to trust human hands at midnight. What the trench refuses to give in artifacts it offers in topography. The old grid of Puticuli runs under everything, a geometry that still whispers through the fill, and even the mirror seems to catch lines in the lamplight that resemble the squared mouths where breath was once stacked for tidiness. The coin's profile softens as it cools, and a small thought unfolds with it. Coins fell in Libitina's precinct as entries fell in ledgers in both actions. Calmed households by making sorrow legible, a civic medicine that still tinges this soil with the aftertaste of numbers. You place the bronze crescent on the coin, and let the avian bone rest above them. It's an accidental eye that looks up at the trench wall, and whether the glance is superstition or composition, it arranges the day's harvest into a face that refuses to close its lids. A mainstream note about grave goods returns like a lantern hung on a nail. Mirrors traveled with the dead because mirrors traveled with the living, and identity in Rome was a task rehearsed every morning. Funerals asked the same gestures to steady hands when the face would not answer to its name. From the slope behind, the gardens of Mycenae step down in memory. Their terraces a political balm over old pits, and the echo of poetry that once walked their Horace's calm eye. Virgil S. Landcrafts seems to bless the idea that a garden is a treaty drafted between breath and silence. You taste iron in the air and realize it is only the trowel's edge against a nail, but the mingled ring recalls how often Roman fear chose iron pins and lintels, bells at processions, nails through rolled lead to hold the night still long enough to finish a sentence. Quirky superstition from the dock strays uphill with a grin that a nail through a feather turns omen into guardian. And though the trench gives you only bone, the logic of reversal belongs here to where policy and legend conspired to make nightbirds stand posts rather than plunder. The avian phalanx catches one more gleam, and for a heartbeat it looks like a tiny laurel leaf, a trick of light that pulls the catacomb wreaths. To mind those quiet circles around signs of victory that taught rooms under Rome how not to raise their voices when hope arrived. A mainstream frame helps the lamp settle. The catacombs and surface cemeteries together created an atlas of care. And even when rites diverged, cremation to inhumation, pagan to Christian, the through line remained the same. Dart and objects placed where breath had ended to prevent panic from starting. The mirror's bevel flashes a last time, and you imagine a face leaning over it 2 millennia ago, a completely ordinary motion that becomes extraordinary here, because the trench serves as stage, and the shard is prop for a truth the city never stopped. Rehearsing competence is a sacrament. Elsewhere on the hill, the Esquiline treasure sleeps in cases, silvered testimony that this ground has yielded splendor, as well as utensils. The shard you hold is no treasure, but it performs the same office, reminding that metal remembers touch long after names dissolve. Greek mythology crouches in the lamplight with its usual grace, nodding to a bird that once spoke in hexameters and now prefers scratches on bronze, while Norse legends pass like a cold shrug behind your neck, reminding that winter birds read trenches too. When night starts early, set each find in a labeled bag coin, avian phalanx. Mirror fragment small envelopes of civility around fragments that would otherwise seem like threats to steadiness, and the simple act becomes a rite, concise enough to teach a household with 1 lamp and 1 worried child. A mainstream cadence holds to the last brushstroke, Esquiline beneath. Gardens above, registry in the grove, coin in the chest, mirror for the hand. Bird for the rumor. Ohm's entire conversation with darkness compressed into 3 objects anyone can recognize by lamplight. What would you do if, when the trench was backfilled and the forms signed, a single owl called from the cypress and the sound seemed to ask whether the coin was receipt? the bone signature, and the mirror a borrowed eye that expects to be returned before dawn. You listen for the line where folklore ends and feeding begins, and the silence answers with a heartbeat that might be the city. Mess or the night, a pulse that measures whether stories are just noise, or the breath by which deities keep their ledgers current. The words that circle the breath are old strix, strigion. They carry both feather and indictment, a Roman habit of letting. Greek mythology lend metamorphosis to a bird and then asking the bird to account for what households cannot make the law believe at dawn. In one ear whispers Ovid's Midnight, the Lemuria, where a householder moves barefoot through rooms clutching black beans, and a formula repeated 9 times the ritual, turning a vague dread into a measured sequence that anyone restless can perform without raising the neighbors. Hec ego mito, redimo, his redemo mech me osc, the line insists, these I send. With these beans I redeem me, and Manand, the bean count, is a metronome for panic, a way to keep breath from feeding the fear it tries to starve. The same calendar that teaches beans and copper also teaches a tone, a methodical cadence that keeps ancient mysteries from shouting, so that heroes of the home wear no armor, except a voice that holds shape even when the strix touches the window with a sound like torn cloth. 8. In the other ear murmurs the canon episcope, a sober voice that says night flights with Diana or Herodias are illusions. Phantasms that the credulous mistake for journeys, and that the true correction is not a pyre, but the penance of learning to call a dream by its proportionate name. Between those two, tones ritual instruction and doctrinal correction the cities. Line becomes audible, a thin thread on which folklore dangles without slipping into frenzy. And yet, the thread still hums because a heartbeat does not have the courtesy to stop when a bishop finishes a paragraph. Roman strix lore refuses to leave the room, even when called delusion. Because Ovid's bird eats more than rumor in stories where claws and beak approach a cradle, and the mind, urged to be reasonable, still counts breaths and windows in case reason is late. You weigh an older practice against a later rubric and realize both protect the same threshold, the house, boundary the lungs. Control the child's sleep, the sense that heroes can win by knowing when to speak and when to keep a hand steady on the latch. The divide where feeding begins is not only in bodies, but in time measured by the ninefold chant, by the turn of a bean, by the moment the beacon a story becomes a weight on a chest at midnight, and the listeners decide whether to treat it as a guest or an intruder. Smith's old dictionary entry recites the particulars with a schoolmaster's calm. Bare feet hand-washing 9 beans cast with averted face, and the recital itself feels like a staircase designed for dark rooms where the real step is. The next breath taken in order. Meanwhile, the canon's passage is clipped, and cool rides do not exist in body. The devil only dilutes, and the very denial feeds a second kind of hunger, the appetite to be certain, which, if unchecked, eats evidence until only doctrine remains where footprints once dried. The bird does not care about arguments. It cares about doors. When a feather lies on a sill at dawn, the city must decide whether the feather is a receipt for panic or only proof that owls hunt mice where grain stores dreams under rafters. Ovid lets the strigoi threaten to disembowel and drink, and though Pliny calls some of it nonsense, the pages show a culture willing to point at a sound and say, there is the mouth that feeds on what we cannot spare, and there is the reason we rehearse courage in lists. The line you are listening for may be a legal line dressed in ritual, the place where folklore's teeth stop at a bean or a bell, and the night agrees to be counted, instead of counting the living a compromise. Heroes, except when swords are useless. Later centuries call the Roman method superstition, incorrect belief, with penances, but even the canon episcopi betrays respect for management. It seeks to keep minds from feeding illusions, yet it also enumerates errors, proving that lists are the city's gentlest spear. Greek mythology is not insulted by the tiding. Metamorphosis has always needed clerks as much as poets in a household that files its fears under deities. Nocturnal manageable is practicing a civic art that turns ancient mysteries into neighbors instead of invaders. Norse legends slide by with their winter brevity, reminding that ravens carry news to heroes and that the dead are named in halls before they are feared, a courtesy that keeps hunger seated long enough to listen without tasting the room. The city's own files stack in the margin Libitina's registry. The coin that falls, the grove's ledger's proof that Rome believes counting can make grief chew slower, and that a counted night feeds less on the living than a nameless one. No one forbids ordinary owls to exist. What is forbidden is letting an omen devour a neighborhood, and that is why beans are thrown behind the back, why bronze is clashed, and why the voice names the ancestors before it sleeps. A later note claims with priestly firmness that Diana's train is a delusion, and Herodias's company a trick of the adversary and the bishop. S aim is to starve the story of its meat so that only the bone of discipline remains to be chewed by habit. Yet even that note concedes what it denies. Illusions are potent to the credulous, which is why the canon catalogues the masking. Deities to accept penance as the ration by which belief learns to stop feeding fear and begin feeding patience. On the side table, a pamphlet retells the Roman Halloween, and a tourist smile beans at midnight. Copper clanged. I redeem me and mine, and though the tone is light. The method is as serious as a sailor's knot, a way to assure the night that the house can count to 9 and will. When the room is this quiet, the heart begins to translate its own knocks. This one for a footstep, this one for a wing, this one for a coin, this one for a clause, and the translation becomes a ritual so close to feeding on fear that only discipline keeps it from crossing the line. You hold the two instructions, side by side, vice sequence, and the canon. Esquiline noticed that both forbid spectacle, both prefer the sober heroism of small acts, both distrust the drama by which the night fattens itself, and both recruit the listener into a rhythm instead of a chase. The Strixian literature is allowed hungry verbs, suck, tear, drink, yet the city's verbs against it are gentler throw, wash, speak in asymmetry that turns out to starve the intruder without making the house impolite to its own breath. If the line must be drawn with a tool, let it be a bean and a bell, for these are instruments that do not overserve the appetite they oppose. And let heroes learn that a list performed calmly is sharper than any spear in a bedroom. The oldest sources repeat that 9 is the number for this negotiation, and each repetition becomes a stake in the ground where the night's rumor cannot graze, fence without spikes that still keeps cattle from the garden. Meanwhile, the canon's fence is in the mind. It's a boundary that keeps the story from growing teeth it did not earn. And the parish that learns this fence discovers fewer bites and fewer boasts on market day. Greek mythology thinks of Lamia, then eyes in a jar by day, Lent by night, a goddess whose feeding begins where sleep ends, and the ritual teaches counterfeeding. Beans for shades, breath for breath, order for appetite, until dawn's first noise redraws the mouth of the dark. Norse legends nod once more from the doorway of winter halls, reminding that oaths, too, must be rationed, and that telling only what needs telling is another way to starve a monster that eats what it hears. So when you listen again for the line, the heartbeat you hear is not only the city's, it is the measured feeding of fear with small dry food, the kind that fills without. What would you do if a feather were discovered on the sill, and a bishop on the step, each offering a different famine for the tale, one of beans and bells, one of penance and denial, and the deities waited for a hero to choose which hunger the night will be allowed to keep. You stand at the last threshold with the arch behind and the grove beside, and the oculus of the Pantheon somewhere. Ahead in memory, and the night waits, as if a clerk has paused mid-entry so a name can be spoken softly enough to fit into the line without tearing it. The mask in the cypress turns once more in the mind sockets cupped to receive borrowed sight in the owl. Dod! Cloth tear cry folds itself into a quieter syllable that belongs to a goddess who has learned to wear function as a face and ledgers as a crown. A mainstream truth steadies breath at the edge of saying. Rome kept certain names secret, guarding the tutelary identity of the city as protector, and even the city's own hidden name, because to speak a true name was to risk evocatio, the calling out, of a patron deity during siege, and to risk handing power to an enemy. Antiquarian pages debate candidates with the patience of librarians more as Rome's palindrome. Maya, as a star mother mapped to hills, but the rule beneath the rumors remains the same. Names at this altitude are not decorations. They are instruments, and instruments are kept in cases until the hour requires them. You feel how Greek mythology has trained the tongue to address deities as persons, and how Rome has trained the hand to address them as offices, and the two trainings braid at this threshold where a goddess of funerals is both a metonymous and a presence, a ledger and a listener. The owl arrives as a silence rather than a shadow, as if the bird has agreed with the arch that loudness would break, the pact drafted under those stones, and that silence contains enough air for a name that does not bruise the night when it lands. Mainstream anchor holds the city's cadence in place. At Libitina, grove deaths were registered, and a coin clinked into a chest, an administration that turned endings into entries so households would not be devoured by their own arithmetic before dawn. Another anchor glows like a lamp behind the ribs on 13. May 609 610 the Pantheon became Santa Maria ad Martyres, and the city translated bones by the cartload into its most perfect dome so that nocturnal vows could migrate from cypress to candle without losing method. Even the canon that denied night rides understood power's economy. Illusions can rule minds, which is why a bishop disciplines belief with penance and catechesis, filing fear until it becomes teachable, the better to keep households from paying appetite in breath. The bizarre detail the night offers as password is small enough to fit on the tongue. The city once hid the name of its guardian goddess on pain of death, and a senator said to have revealed it paid with his life, a law that treats speech like a torch in a granary. Do you remember the lettered rumor that Rome herself had a secret name to keep foreign generals from stealing her spirit by speaking? It at the walls a practice the antiquarians fold beneath the rubric of evocatio, a rite so efficient that silence became the city's most pious armor. Everything you carry has become an offering without changing weight beans. Counted ninefold at Lemuria. A nail through a feather, a mirror shard, a coin the size of a moon. A lead tablet folded like a closed wing, each item a sentence the knight has already learned to read. The owl shifts and the cypress listens and the arch keeps time the way arches do, by being exactly themselves, and you understand that too. Speak the goddess's name here is not to summon her but to acknowledge that she has already allocated her attention across the precincts that asked for it. A mainstream voice returns with its cool grammar. In Nero's autumn, a single season saw 30,000 deaths recorded at the shrine. A statistic that still behaves like weather in the mind, a pressure reading that makes names condense into the heaviest kind of rain. You hold the utterance at the teeth like a coin before a chest, and ask whether the knight prefers titles to epithets, functions, to faces, metonyms, to biographies, and the knight answers by not interrupting, which in this city is assent enough to sign a page. Greek mythology offers Lamia's precedenta, queen who trades sleep for sight, removes eyes by day and sets them back by night hand. The memory of her jar whispers that certain names are tools, and tools work best when handled by those who know which hinge they turn. Near the arch, a small oscilla swings in a wind that has decided to be courteous, and the oscillation feels like punctuation, teaching breathware to bend a grammar lesson offered to anyone who still believes lungs can be persuaded more gently than they can be conquered. The true name in this city is never a shout. It is a lowered tone that fits under the chisel scar where an emperor's letters were erased under the Pantheons. Oculus, where martyrs now receive petitions under the bean count, and the copper clang where a house bargains with its shadows. You think of Norse legends, ravens naming the fallen to a one-eyed god, and feel how names carry bodies from chaos to chorus, the same service rendered by undertakers at a gate where the Servian wall once breathed like a rib under cypress. The mainstream map of this hour is almost painfully simple. The deities are present where procedures are kept, and Rome's holiness often hides in competence registers closed on time, candles trimmed to last the vigil, masks hung so sockets face the place that needs watching. The name you speak is the shape of the work rather than a syllable for power. Libitina as ledger as Lucas, as labor is the cool hand that balances the column when the number climbs too fast, and the response you receive is a redistribution of quiet across the garden paths. A quirky sign seals the exchange. The moth that landed on the nail through the feather does not move even now, as if a living comma had agreed to hold the sentence open for a few breaths longer so the city can finish saying what it meant to say at the very beginning. The owl answers with a note almost like a page turning, and you recognize it not as hunger but as filing, a clerical sound that places tonight among knights that remembered to count, and counts among tools that remembered to be kind. Greek mythology inclines its head once more, pleased that metamorphosis can be a schedule as well as a spectacle, and the arch, which has learned to accept rededications without cracking, stands for the argument that a city's covenant endures best when written in reuse. The name, softly spoken, does not claim authority over the goddess. It acknowledges jurisdictions shared the household's ritual, the bishop's rubric, the registries and relics and arches, and the acknowledgement is the only magic the city has ever fully trusted. Somewhere, a clerk at Santa Maria ad Martyres dots an I in a parish death book. a quiet twin to the ancient chest's clink, and the dot feels like a star caught by the oculus right before rain. The smallest signature of the largest pact the city can keep. A mainstream whisper follows like a benediction. Each town had tutelary guardians. Odd guarded hers by secrecy, then by conversion, then by continuity of care. And that is why the night behaves here as it seldom does elsewhere, answering a request to spare the living and keep the dead in order. You step back from the threshold, and the ground feels level underfoot. A confirmation as modest as any miracle deserves to be when it concerns ledgers and lamps. And the owl drifts to a perch that overlooks more windows than one name could possibly protect alone. What would you do if tomorrow the city woke calmer and the cypress dropped a single feather onto the arch? A stone like a receipt, and no one could say whether the goddess's true name had been spoken or whether competence alone had managed to make the dark keep its side of the bargain. Wind down. The night loosens its shoulders, and the air that held so many careful syllables exhales in a single, unbroken line, the way a river slows at its mouth, and the brine takes the weight from fresh water, without argument, trading edges for a broader calm that leaves each bank more itself than before. Steps along the garden path sound like cloth brushed once against cedar. Not hurrying now, not counting anything but the distance between lamp and door. And that distance, which was so long an hour ago, shortens into a few soft strides anyone can make without remembering the rules that kept fear from learning the way in. The owl that once cut the air like torn linen perches, as quietly as punctuation. At the end of a sentence that is finally said exactly enough, and the feather on the stone stops being a sign and becomes instead a small decoration, the breeze will tidy in its own time. Candles do what they have always done when no one is watching. Pool a gentle light, breathe a low perfume of wax and thread, and accept being brief without making a drama of it, so that the room can let its shoulders drop and learn the luxury of listening without anticipating a knock. The names that mattered tonight fold themselves into the same careful drawer, not hidden, only resting while the tools that kept them company, beans and bells and mirrors, crescent and nail through a feather take on the silence of objects that know their work is done until someone needs the comfort of ritual again. If the city dreams, it dreams in even measures like a slow hymn that understands why it should finish a phrase before sleeping, and if the dream remembers. The grove, the arch, the oculus, and the soft ledgering of breath into order, it does so with a smile that no one will see, but everyone will feel when morning opens the window. For now, the garden of Mycenas is only a garden, the catacombs only cool corridors of paint and patience, and the harbor only a sheet of moon hammered thin by a wind that prefers to kiss rather than test, while the hills keep their posts and the houses keep their secrets simple. The last thing to fade is not a word or a wing, but the small contentment that lives in the chest. When a task is completed without haste, the kind that carries forward into breakfast, into the moving of chairs, into the laying of a coin, in a dish-quiet heroism dressed as ordinary care. Sleep takes the weight of the story easily now, the way a steady shoulder takes a cloak and smooths it once. The breath that remains in the room lengthens without asking permission, stating that the night has been taught its manners well enough to be trusted until daybreak.